Without pause, the glowing head of Hogan's flail flew through the air on a long chain and slammed into the destroyer's face. Fandrel's figure left a long trail of afterimages as he flew over, his meteor-like sword beam stabbing into the hole which the spear had created. Then, Volstag's great axe and Sif's longsword followed suit as they struck the hole created by the spear with all their strength. The destroyer's body, which had been moving freely, suddenly paused for a moment, and there was a slight explosion in its face. Loki finally looked surprised. "You actually injured the destroyer?" He hadn't really obtained the right to use the destroyer. He could only rely on the spear Gungnir which he was holding to do some basic operations. Apart from the destroyer's own astonishing defense and physical attacks, its other high-end abilities, which included the light beam, were basically unusable. It couldn't even bring out 5% of its overall power. However, such a destroyer was terrifying enough. Loki sneered. "Too bad you can't break it. It's a waste." The destroyer was a divine artifact created by Odin. As long as one didn't have overwhelming power, it was as foolish as fighting a war of attrition. As foolish as the few traitors who were struggling on their deathbed. Yes, and that small flea. Loki slightly straightened his back and leaned back in his throne chair. It was just a small problem. He would only be wasting a few minutes at most. Luke, on the other hand, frowned and finally found the time to call Phil. "Didn't I tell you not to come over? Your weapons can't even scratch the surface of that android." "Phil, it's our duty." Luke was a little anxious. F***ck duty, this is just looking to die. "Stay away, the Asgardians can deal with it themselves." Phil was silent for a moment, before he finally relented. "All right, I'll wait 5 minutes. But you should get out too. You're not its target." Mind racing, Luke quickly made a decision. "Fine." At that moment, Destroyer was being pressed to the ground by the warriors 3 and Sif. This was the best time to withdraw. He was the one who had created this opportunity to counterattack, so this couldn't be considered running away. Secondly, Thor still had a constipated expression on his face. He would probably awaken the power of his ancestors later, and prove again that even a god had to rely on the power of his ancestors. If he didn't leave now, when could he? Luke changed directions in the pickup and sped toward the hill. Immediately, his expression turned ugly. More than 200 meters to his left, 7 or 8 shield black SUVs rushed down the road on the other side of the hill, heading straight for the concrete maze. Luke asked Phil, who was still on the line, "What's going on? Why are your people still approaching?" "That's not under my order." Phil immediately asked his men about the situation. A few seconds later, he said in an angry voice, "It's Sitwell. He's taken 3 teams with him." As for whether or not this agent Sitwell was trying to steal credit for the spoils of battle, Phil didn't say. Luke was too lazy to guess. He said, "Then don't be as stupid as him." "Phil, I'm sorry, but those are my men." If it was just Sitwell, Phil might have given up on such an idiot. But Sitwell also had a dozen SHIELD agents with him, and Phil couldn't ignore them. Luke couldn't help but curse WTF in his heart, but he spoke even faster. Dragging his teammates in at a critical moment like this, it's best for this sort of person to just die. Phil said nothing, and suddenly cut the connection. Luke slapped the steering wheel, his face grim. One shouldn't be afraid of a godlike opponent, but of a pig-like teammate. This was the truth of the ages. Luke was good at being a teammate. Just now, he had simply relied on dozens of shots to create a good opportunity for Sif and the others, and they didn't need to look out for him at all. This could only be described as a miraculous operation. But what was up with that idiot Sitwell? Didn't he understand that a skinny elephant could still crush a large group of ants just by moving its body? Moreover, the destroyer was still a long way from death. This kind of brainless idiot was just serving his own head up on a platter. The most important thing was that he had gone against orders and even brought a bunch of men with him to deliver their own heads. Looking at the surveillance feed, Luke saw more than 20 cars coming down from Phil's side. His mind raced, and the pickup suddenly changed directions and drove into the shrubs. In a few seconds, 7 or 8 SUVs arrived at the turn, separated from him by a hill. Luke gently pressed the fire button. Thump thump. Thump thump. Thump thump. Rhythmic, consecutive shots sent mud and rocks flying in all directions. The ferocious recoil caused the heavy body of the modified pickup to tremble as it was pushed back. There was the sound of tires screeching on gravel. Luke dialed Phil's number again, and the call went through 2 seconds later. "If you dare come down, I'll burst all your tires." "Phil, you. This is obstruction of official duty. You'll be charged." Luke chuckled. "I'm sorry. I'm the law around here, and I have the power to deal with emergency situations here. If you have any objections, please contact my superior, Robert, and ask him to call me." Even experienced and calm Phil couldn't help but rub his head. He felt that his hairline would definitely recede another 2 centimeters when he went back after this. Even worse, he couldn't call Robert or charge Luke. So, the dozens of agents which Phil had brought with him were temporarily stuck halfway on the slope of the hill. 2 minutes after Luke left the battlefield, the situation at the concrete maze had changed drastically. Phil and Luke stopped talking almost at the same time and looked at the surveillance feed. When Luke noticed Phil and went to stop him, the Warriors 3 and Sif didn't stop attacking. They knew that it wouldn't be easy for the 4 of them to destroy the destroyer, but they could try to make it malfunction and greatly weaken it. Now was the best moment since the start of the battle. For a time, the 4 of them didn't need to communicate much. They took turns tacitly and continued to pry open the destroyer's head. The destroyer also suffered the greatest damage since the start of the battle. Eve's spear was the only true divine weapon that had been blessed by the All-Father Odin. It was a reward that Odin had bestowed upon her for her loyalty to Thor for many years. It was also the only weapon that could compete with the destroyer. The reason Sif was struggling slightly was because this spear wasn't as high-end as the destroyer. The spear focused mainly on breaking through defenses, and had a slight suppression effect. Destroying the destroyer would require a combination of magic power and weapons. The ensuing explosive offensive power would be able to overcome the destroyer's durability. To put it simply, this divine spear had ample physical attack power, but it didn't have any magic attacks. It was just a support-type weapon. The Warriors 3 and Sif also didn't have strong magic output, and couldn't make up for this weakness. Among all the people present, only Thor, who had once been the god of thunder, had this strength, but this leader was now weak as a dog and could only be a spectator. The drawbacks of not being able to deal enough damage began to show in half a minute. The destroyer gradually recovered from their continuous attacks. It bent its legs so that its feet were placed firmly on the ground. It pulled at the spear in its head, trying to break free from being pinned down by it. Seeing this, the 4 friends increased the rhythm of their attacks. Although it was difficult for the destroyer to move, it still managed to escape from the spear. The moment it broke free, the destroyer recovered most of its combat power again. In an instant, it forced 2 of the Warriors 3 to retreat with 2 slaps, and Sif and the other also decisively withdrew. Without teamwork, they would be easily killed if they fought alone. The weakling, Thor, was nearby. There was no room for error. However, all of these efforts seemed to be in vain. After another major miscalculation, Loki had exhausted his playful thoughts. Far away on the throne in Asgard's golden palace, he even felt his face burn. If it wasn't for the fact that the other party didn't have enough instant damage output, the destroyer would have been seriously damaged, even if it wasn't blown up. He didn't have the ability to repair the destroyer on his own, and it would be difficult for him to do something to Thor now. Realizing that he still had a chance of winning, he finally became serious and controlled the destroyer to attack with full force. In less than a minute, 2 of the Warriors 3 were severely injured and 1 was slightly injured. The severely injured Volstagg and Hogan were beaten until they dropped amidst the concrete blocks and vomited blood. It was Fandral who suffered minor injuries. One arm and one leg was broken as he fell on the outer edge of the concrete maze. The strongest female warrior, Sif, was in the clutches of the destroyer, who held her up in front of its face. "Look at you, weak, pitiful, and helpless. Where is the person you are protecting so desperately? What is he doing? How is he worth following?" Sif spat hatefully. "He has the courage to go forward, and a sincere and frank heart, unlike you who can only hide in the back and play tricks. Loki, you will never be qualified to be the king of Asgard." But Loki wasn't angry now. The victor did not need to care about the cries of these defeated dogs. He turned to Thor. "Do you think so too, my brother? This is the FBI. Put down your weapons immediately and cooperate with our investigation," a loudspeaker from an SUV sounded. Everyone present turned to look. Even the injured warriors 3 and Sif, who was being gripped by the neck, couldn't help but look over. Where the hell did this idiot come from? Was he blind or dumb? Loki placed a hand on his forehead. "The humans of Midgard have really opened my eyes." As soon as he finished speaking, the destroyer turned its head and its mask opened as a yellow light quickly brightened. A glowing beam shot out. Rumble. The SUV which the shout had come from was blasted 5 to 6 meters away by the laser beam. It flipped in the air and crashed heavily on the ground. In a car behind it, the bald agent, Sitwell, rolled his eyes and roared, "Get out of the car and open fire." With that, he immediately picked up the wireless comm. "Phil, we need backup here. We need backup." Only then did Phil and Luke stop talking at that moment. Phil gritted his teeth. Head down. However, before the driver could even step on the gas pedal, he saw flames exploding at the turn in front of him. Boom. The driver paused and said, "Boss, the entire slope next to the road has collapsed. The cars can't get past. Shall we take a detour?" It was one thing to provide support on foot. It would take at least 3 to 5 minutes to run from here to the concrete maze under the hill. And their heavy weapons and ammunition were in the cars. They couldn't give up. What was happening on the other side was too big, and the agents felt that ordinary rifles wouldn't be of use. Only the autocannons on the 2 armored vehicles might be able to fight. Naturally, no one wanted to give up on the armored vehicles and have to attack the terrifying giant android with small pistols. Phil said, "Go around the other side." Luke had already tapped into S.H.I.E.L.D.'s wireless comm feed, and knew that something was wrong when he heard the request for help. With a thought, an RPG appeared in his hand, and he instantly brought down the large mud slope next to the road, temporarily blocking Phil's fastest way down the hill. At the same time, he immediately took out his fake phone and started operating it quickly. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a bald man in a black suit retreating quickly. Luke narrowed his eyes. What was going on? He couldn't help but recall the scene in some anti-war films where the incompetent officer shouted, "Attack," while running away. After the SUV was sent flying before it landed on the ground, more than 10 agents immediately opened fire. More than 10 handguns and rifles aimed at the destroyer and fired wildly. The flying bullets hit the destroyer. Loki, who had been on guard, was instantly relieved. The bullets fired by these people didn't have the strange effect of the shells fired by the pickup just now. These were ordinary Midgardians. He was instantly annoyed at his cowardice. As a god, how could he act so careful around these Midgardians? The destroyer threw away Sif in his hand, and the cannon in its face gathered power again. A thick light beam shot out and did a diagonal sweep. Boom! 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 3 cars were hit by the laser beam and exploded instantly. They weren't the thick concrete blocks which Luke had gotten made. Compared with the 2-meter thick concrete blocks with steel plates, the SUVs were so thin that they could explode at any moment. 7 or 8 agents were instantly injured by the broken parts of the cars, and fell to the ground. Luke noticed all of this, but his expression remained calm. While the destroyer attacked the vehicles, the fake phone completed its adjustment and issued an activation command. In the concrete maze, there were suddenly large holes in many of the well-preserved concrete blocks. The black launch ports inside locked on at the same time, and a large number of rockets shot out at the destroyer, who was much taller than the concrete blocks. Boom! 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 There was a series of explosions, and the destroyer's upper body was covered in flames. A moment later, the destroyer emerged from the smoke and fire. Other than the fact that its upper body was blackened from the smoke and there were a few scratches, it wasn't damaged at all. Luke was as calm as ever. He had expected that. After the first armor-piercing shell test, this batch of rockets could only be used as a means of interference and couldn't injure the destroyer. However, the SHIELD agents nearby who were firing at the destroyer had ugly expressions on their faces. More than 10 rockets couldn't hurt this big android. What use were their small pistols? They subconsciously started to retreat. Their weapons couldn't even scratch the other party's skin. They were just sitting ducks here. They were trained at SHIELD to do everything they could to complete missions, but they weren't taught to die for no reason. SHIELD spent a lot of time and resources to train elite agents, and they weren't in the habit of wasting the lives of agents. Phil, who had just come around the other way down the hill, frowned. SHIELD surveillance hadn't picked up Luke's first armor-piercing shell, so they hadn't known how strong the destroyer's defense was. Now that the destroyer was unscathed by the rocket shower, Phil knew that he had no weapons on his side that could deal with the destroyer. "Stop," Phil ordered decisively. Loki frowned and checked the state of the destroyer. He found nothing wrong, so he ignored the inexplicable firework attack and looked at Thor again. "Are these your reinforcements? You've been reduced to relying on Midgardians to save your life. How pitiful." Thor's face darkened as he walked slowly toward the destroyer. "No, they're innocent." Loki grinned wickedly. "But they'll die later, too." "Thor, I know you have complaints about me." Loki, "Heh, of course." "Thor, I know you're unhappy with me." Loki, "That's called contempt." "Thor, but you know how much father and mother love you." Loki fell silent. "Thor, if killing me can make you stop, then come. Let us end this meaningless fight." As he spoke, he had already walked in front of the destroyer. He spread his hands, indicating that he had no intention of resisting, and only looked up at the destroyer's lowered face. The yellow light cannon flashed for a moment, then suddenly disappeared, and the destroyer's facial armor returned to normal. On the side, the 3 heavily injured warriors 3 and Sif were relieved. It seemed that Thor's words had worked. After a moment of silence, the destroyer turned around, as if to leave. "Thor, Loki, you still love father and mother, don't you? You also love me, your brother, right?" The destroyer's body faltered, and it suddenly turned and swung its arm, sending a 270-degree backhand slap across the face. Duong. The metal palm slapped the crown prince's left cheek, producing a crisp sound. With Luke's dynamic vision, he could even see how Thor's face twisted and his neck stretched before his body flew dozens of meters like a cannonball. He landed on the grass outside the pile of concrete blocks and rolled for more than 10 meters before he fell to the ground. The 4 friends. Looking at Thor, who looked like he was dead, Luke found it strange. Did this count as a protagonist dying from talking too much? Could it be that he had made his little brother so angry that the latter had killed him to silence him? So, Sister G really loved this silly big brother? Was everything that had happened just a love-hate relationship? The absurd thoughts flashed through Luke's mind, but he didn't move. Thor was the protagonist. His father Odin wasn't dead yet, so His Highness the Crown Prince couldn't die. The system also clearly said that Thor was in a sealed state. It wasn't that easy for him to die. The destroyer floated upward as if it was weightless, and drifted toward Thor. Everyone thought Loki was going to give an eulogy or something. But the destroyer stepped forward again and hit Thor. "You idiot! Who the hell loves you? Duong!" Thor flew dozens of meters again and rolled a dozen more times on the grass. Everyone. So, he was just twisting the knife. The two eyes on the destroyer's visor flickered yellow for a few moments, as if to make sure Thor was dead, before it turned back to the pile of concrete blocks. The faces of the warriors 3 and Sif were filled with despair, but no matter how hard they tried to get up and fight, they could no longer do so with their heavily injured bodies. The destroyer hadn't gone easy on them at all just now, but they hadn't died on the spot because of the strength of their godly bodies. Looking at the 4 struggling companions, the destroyer scanned them for a moment, before Loki chuckled. The laugh was full of sarcasm. Volstagg growled, "Kill me if you dare, or I'll kill you sooner or later." Loki chuckled again. "Kill you? As if. I, Loki, the king of Asgard, hereby announce that you will always be traitors of Asgard, and will not be allowed to return until the day you die." After announcing this decision, he looked at the 4 angry people and felt extremely happy. "Aren't you very loyal? Then, you will live in Midgard and guard that idiot Thor's grave. I don't know how you will feel when you see his tombstone every day, ha 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 ha." There was the sound of sobbing behind Loki, slightly disturbing his mood. He frowned and looked, only to see a woman crying as she ran toward Thor's body. Further away, the small flea had pulled another woman behind a large rock. Luke looked at Darcy with a pained expression. "What are you doing here? Do you want to die?" "Darcy, Dr. Jane wanted to come. I was afraid she would be in danger." Even if she said that, Luke could sense her curiosity. Only this strong obsession could break through Luke's safety training and make her come to watch the show. But he didn't have the patience or time to coax her now. He only said with a cold face, "The biggest danger is the 2 of you coming here. Now, shut up and stay still." Darcy stared blankly at the little detective who had suddenly turned tough. She wasn't angry at all. Instead, she exclaimed inwardly, "This little brother is so manly now. I can't take it, I love it." On the other side, Loki didn't pay much attention to Luke. After all, he hadn't really been able to damage the destroyer from the beginning. At most, he was an annoyance. Now Dr. Jane, who was still crying over Thor, was more attractive to him. Should I send this strange woman to heaven with a single shot? This thought involuntarily surfaced in his mind. It definitely wasn't because he found this woman too noisy. Women were too troublesome. Crybaby women were even more troublesome. With a thought, the destroyer's visor opened, and the beam cannon began to power up again. Dr. Jane didn't notice the movement. She already couldn't stop crying as she hugged Thor. Seeing this, Luke cursed inwardly. This was Thor's girlfriend. If she really died here, it would be hard to say if Thor would still come to Earth. The point was, if Thor didn't come to Earth to become a superhero, how was Luke going to get a complete list of Thor's abilities? Luke pressed Darcy down on the ground and said, "Lie down and don't move." With that, he broke into a run, a barret already in his hand. Bang! The light cannon in the destroyer's face suddenly dimmed. Loki's sneer fell. The next moment, the destroyer flew toward Luke. As Luke ran, he yelled, "Thor, Jane is going to die if you don't wake up." The destroyer subconsciously stopped and turned to look at Thor, only to see that the silly brother was still stiff in the woman's arms, and showed no signs of coming back to life. However, Loki hesitated. That idiot wouldn't really get up again, would he? Perhaps he shouldn't have held back at the end of the fight. "Thor, your brother wants to kill your father and mother," Luke shouted as he ran. "Loki, how dare you slander me?" With a thought, the destroyer flew toward Luke again, and the cannon lit up. Bang! Luke suddenly moved sideways, and the cannon brushed past him. Looking at Thor, who still hadn't moved, Luke sighed in his heart. Forget it, let's do it for real. Otherwise, he would be pushed around for the whole night. But the destroyer was closing in on him as he ran. As if the long black barret was in his way, Luke swung it onto his back with his right hand. Loki, he. Bang! It was the legendary ambush and snipe, and Luke was using the barret to do it. Luke didn't let go of the barret. Instead, he pulled the trigger. A special armor-piercing bullet curved strangely and hit the destroyer in the face. As he fired, Luke picked up speed and hightailed it out of there. Boom! A white light exploded in the destroyer's face, and instantly turned into a large ball of blue light which spread out in all directions. Boom! A large part of the ground within a 10-meter radius disappeared in the wake of the blue light. The destroyer's huge body suddenly stopped and collapsed, as though its limbs were weak. It fell into the huge pit that had just appeared. Luke didn't even turn around to check the outcome of the attack. He kept running toward the couple in the concrete maze. If Thor didn't come back to life, don't blame Luke for kissing Dr. Jane on the spot to make His Royal Highness jealous. I don't believe that you can still tolerate it then. The detective was mulling over this suicidal notion, when he suddenly stopped in his tracks. The wind was blowing. There was always wind in the Texan wilderness at night. However, the wind at this moment brought with it an indescribable sense of oppression, as if something was about to appear. In just a few breaths, the wind grew stronger and stronger. In the blink of an eye, it changed from a light breeze to a strong wind, and then to a gale. Sand and dust also rose. Everyone's clothes fluttered in the wind as they looked around. The four Asgardian companions, however, had surprised and expectant expressions as they looked at Thor's body. Luke, on the other hand, reacted differently. He looked behind the hill where Mjolnir was. On his glasses, the image from the drone started to flash, and little Snail warned, an extremely strong electromagnetic interference is occurring at the location of the Mjolnir hammer. One of the SHIELD researchers in the pit with the Mjolnir hammer began to shout, "It's moving. The hammer is shaking. The instruments are detecting strong electromagnetic interference." At that moment, the destroyer, which had fallen into a pit, stood up with some difficulty. The yellow light in its eyes flickered a few times before it finally stomped and jumped out of the pit. For the first time tonight, it was severely damaged and had temporarily lost the ability to fly. It could only jump. Standing outside the crater, the eyes on its mask were like damaged light bulbs, flickering with yellow light. Loki gritted his teeth. "I didn't know you had weapons from an intergalactic civilization." The bullet which Luke had shot at the destroyer wasn't just an ordinary bullet, but a piece of the Predator's technology. After obtaining the ability to assemble and disassemble items in his storage space, he had done more in-depth research on the energy storage system of the Predator's shoulder cannon and the super bomb. After some verification, he invented a super low-quality knockoff experimental version and added it to some of his best weapons. That special sniper rifle bullet was one of them. The special bullet was the equivalent of turning the energy storage system of the shoulder cannon into an energy bullet which would directly detonate. But the small amount of energy stored in the special bullet wasn't enough to seriously injure the destroyer. However, Luke had used elementary annihilation with his sniper rifle. The attack power of this bullet was probably countless times more powerful, and it completely pierced the transparent protective layer over the destroyer's face. The huge energy inside the special bullet entered this gap to cause unknown damage inside the destroyer. Even Loki now didn't know the extent of the damage to the destroyer. He only felt that his control over it had loosened. It was as if the destroyer was now mechanically crippled, pausing at every order given. That damned little flea. Loki looked around angrily, trying to find that human. "I won't look down on you anymore. I'll stomp you to death." While Loki was thinking this, he suddenly felt that something wasn't right. This wind, was a little noisy. Crack. A flash suddenly streaked across the sky behind the hill. Loki, who was far away in Asgard, trembled reflexively. This scene was too familiar. It made him remember his fear of his idiot brother's dominance. "You must be joking," he muttered. The destroyer saw a certain idiot, who was originally lying on the ground, suddenly raise his hand. Rumble. A series of thunderclaps echoed in the wilderness. The destroyer could even see an object wrapped in blazing lightning charge into the sky from behind the hill. It stopped in an instant, turned, and charged down again. Loki gulped. Mjolnir. Everything happened in less than 5 seconds as the object wrapped in lightning dropped steadily into Thor's hand, like a cat returning to its nest. Boom. The sound and light effects were all on full blast. There was no exclusive BGM, but right now, the wind, lightning, and thunder were the best BGM. Before Dr. Jane could react, she was blown away by a blast of wind and fell into the grass. Fortunately, this could only be considered an aftershock. Apart from cutting a sorry figure after falling into the pile of grass, she didn't suffer any injuries. She didn't care about anything else. As she got up, her eyes immediately found the man. Countless tiny electric arcs wrapped around Thor's body and made him float upward. Mjolnir, which was still raised high, shot out countless dazzling electric arcs. Fish-scale armor appeared out of thin air and started wrapping around Thor's 4 limbs. Finally, a dazzling bright red cloak fluttered behind him. Dr. Jane was stunned. She muttered subconsciously, O.M.G. Darcy, who was leaning out from behind a large rock in the distance, and Dr. Selvig, who was trying to climb out of some pit, saw what happened, and were equally stunned. Only Darcy muttered, "Is Meow Meow Hammer really that awesome?" Luke was relieved to see the dramatic change in Thor. Fortunately, Thor's father still favored his son. After this experience, Thor was revived on the spot. Loki could only be the little brother for the rest of his life. Ducking behind a mound, Luke put the Barrett back into his storage space and started watching the show. At first, it was the little brother who beat up the older brother. Now, it was the traditional family drama where the older brother would beat up the little brother. Luke, the Warriors 3 and Sif weren't important, they were just extras responsible for shouting, "Thor, awesome." Of course, Luke wouldn't shout, because he wasn't a side character. Loki was only stunned for a moment, before he came back to himself. He subconsciously manipulated the destroyer to attack. As soon as the destroyer's visor opened, the yellow light inside began to glow. Suddenly, it sputtered a few times, before it was cut off, like an engine. F***CKU. Loki cursed inwardly as the destroyer ran at Thor. Thor's raised hand swung down suddenly in a vicious throw, and the hammer in his hand disappeared. Duong. Just like when Thor had been hit earlier, the entire head of the practically invincible destroyer was jerked around 180 degrees and his huge body flew hundreds of meters away. Thor was no longer depressed. Hammer in hand, the feeling of power rose unbidden. This was a great treasure that had accompanied him in crushing countless enemies. As long as he picked it up, he had nothing to fear. The destroyer? Unless Thor's father, Odin, personally controlled it, it was nothing. He raised his hand and opened it. Mjolnir, which had smashed fiercely into the destroyer, stopped and immediately returned to his hand. He grabbed the handle of the hammer and spun it like a propeller. Thor flew toward the destroyer. The wind howled, lightning struck, and thunder rumbled. He, who had become the god of thunder again, charged at the destroyer with a terrifying aura. He had already discovered that the destroyer wasn't in the best of shape at the moment. Someone like him, who had led the Asgardian army in battle for thousands of years, didn't hesitate as he firmly seized this opportunity. In Asgard, on the other hand, Loki had a dark expression on his face. His idiot brother had been revived and was in peak condition, but the destroyer he was manipulating was only half operational. How was it supposed to fight? Unfortunately, it wasn't up to him to decide whether to fight or not. The destroyer had no more light beam, and Thor was no longer under any restrictions. In less than 10 seconds, he had dealt the final blow, as his body turned in the air and he launched downward. The spinning Mjolnir hammer in front of him smashed down on the destroyer like a cannonball. Loki, who was sitting on the throne, subconsciously closed his eyes and turned his head. Then, he felt his connection with the destroyer break. The corners of his mouth twitched. The destroyer was a powerful treasure that could be controlled remotely and wouldn't leak secrets. His heart ached at losing it. However, his brother obviously wouldn't feel sorry for this old thing that had been left in the treasure vault for many years. Sitting on the throne, he pondered for a long while with a gloomy expression. Finally, he made up his mind, and decided to start that plan. Thor. Hee, just play with mud on Earth. Without the Bifrost, it would be difficult for Thor and those 4 annoying people to return to Asgard, which worked out well for Loki's plan. With that in mind, Loki rose and quickly left the palace. He would let Laufey into Asgard. Well, he also had to throw Heimdall into a secret prison to prevent that guy from leaking secrets. Luke remained silent. He quietly watched a certain heir put on a show. The process: Thor was revived on the spot, Thor's special sound, light, and CG effects made an appearance, Thor let loose, and Thor took down the destroyer in seconds. The entire thing took less than a minute. But in those few seconds, Luke had gained a good understanding of this MVP of the Avengers. Especially with the destroyer as a comparison, Luke could sense the difference between him and the other party even more. He had fought the destroyer, and so had the warriors 3 and Sif. Hence, it wasn't difficult to come to a conclusion about Thor, who had taken down the destroyer as soon as he opened his eyes. There was no comparison. However, Luke didn't feel any negative emotions, he wouldn't feel inferior or weak. Even if he had the system, he had only been holding onto the thigh of this godfather for a year and a half. How could he compare? Thor had hugged his own father's thigh before he was even born, he was a super 1,000-year-old heir. If Luke could work diligently to harvest credit and experience points for more than 1,000 years, he would also be as strong, or even stronger than Thor. Therefore, there was no need for envy, much less hate. All he needed was time. As long as he had 8 to 10 years, he would be able to walk his own path of power. While Luke was thinking these things, Thor had finished his work and was pulling his girlfriend Jane out of the grass pile. He felt awkward about this little accident. He could only be thankful that Dr. Jane had fallen into the grass and not the cow manure next to it. Otherwise, Thor doesn't know if he could still have her in the future. But there were tactless people everywhere, and in a story, they usually appeared at the end. A bald man who was hiding with several agents in black suits behind an SUV shouted through a loudspeaker, "This is S.H.I.E.L.D. Listen up, drop your weapons and cooperate with our investigation." Thor frowned. He wanted to smash that blathering Baldy's car with his hammer, but gave up the notion when he looked at Jane in his arms. Jane had to live in this world, it was best if these officials didn't make a scene. Why did Thor understand this? He was the #1 official of the 9 realms, of course he understood the trouble which came with provoking officials. He had dealt with countless officials who made trouble for Asgard. As someone who had just gone through a family melodrama and suffered a huge blow to his heart, Thor was also beginning to understand the need to compromise. Thus, he said, "I am Thor Odinson, protector of the 9 realms, and the god of thunder of Asgard." Suddenly, a fleet of cars rushed over and came to a stop. A group of agents in black suits came down. Phil had a warm smile on his face, but he said loudly, "Thor, do you remember me? I'm the person with the highest authority here. You can speak to me on any matter." The bald Sitwell's mouth dropped open, but he was unable to respond. Among the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents present, Phil was a level 6 with the highest authority, while Sitwell was only a level 4. Also, Phil was the person in charge of this mission, so Sitwell could only be considered a subordinate. The bald agent, Sitwell, wasn't actually brain damaged. It had been his plan from the beginning to cause trouble. He had thus brought a group of agents down here to court death, so that S.H.I.E.L.D. would provoke these powerful aliens. It then wouldn't be easy to resolve the ensuing blood feud. Also, this would frustrate Phil's efforts and hinder Nick Fury's progress. But now that everything had quieted down, Sitwell could no longer stir up trouble. If he acted too overtly, Phil would definitely have him investigated by internal affairs when they went back, which would hold Sitwell back from doing a lot of things. For now, this would only be considered an impulsive act. They had people in internal affairs. He just needed to go through the motions when he went back, he wouldn't even need to admit his mistake. Phil's backer was Fury, but Sitwell's backer was a third of S.H.I.E.L.D., who was afraid of who? Thinking this, he silently shut his mouth. Thor looked at Phil with a much better expression. It couldn't be said that he had a favorable impression of this smiling middle-aged man, but compared with the bald man, at least he didn't hate the former. Even when he had been questioned previously, this person's attitude was only businesslike and didn't insult the dignity of Asgard's crown prince. And this smile. Why did it look a little familiar? Thor couldn't help but look at the young man who was pulling his four friends out of the pile of concrete blocks tens of meters away. He then turned around to look at the middle-aged man in front of him, and considered their names as well. After gaining some faint understanding, he immediately nodded. Okay, then I'll be frank. Luke didn't really care what Phil and Thor talked about. Phil was a good person. The only people who hated him were the bad guys. No one in the Avengers really hated him. Even Tony, who was the most arrogant, got impatient with Phil, but not annoyed. This kind of person was most suitable for communicating with others. Luke focused his attention on the Warriors 3 and Sif, especially Sif. Of course, he never considered flirting with her. However, she was the most likely Asgardian person he could establish friendly relations with. Who asked her to be the only woman among the 5 friends? How high was Sif's status? If Thor inherited the throne, she would be the new king of Asgard's most trusted general, and even the king's closest leader of the guards. This was something that many people who watched the movie wouldn't have thought of. However, after Luke met Sif and learned some things, he had some inkling. Also, the moment Sif felt grateful toward him, the list of her abilities would be made available to Luke. Presumably, this female warrior had Odin's protection. It was very unlikely that the system wouldn't be able to read and make her abilities available. She also liked studying a little more than the war general Thor, so she should have more basic knowledge of Asgard. After all, Thor was the future king. The king didn't need to know too much about technology at the middle and lower levels, he just needed to grasp the core of power. As the future king's general, Sif must have more knowledge to be qualified for this position. When Luke placed her on the flat, slanted surface of a concrete block, she thanked him, although her expression was gloomy. Luke simply smiled. No need to be down. As long as you're alive, everything is possible. If you're dead, you have no chance. Sif was stumped. You. Luke pointed at the destroyer's broken body. That thing was powerful, but you're also strong. You don't have to be discouraged. Sif understood. Thank you. She almost thought that Luke was talking about Thor and Dr. Jane, who were hugging each other. His words made her subconsciously think, Dr. Jane was only an earthling, who would grow old and die in a few short decades. It was indeed unlikely that she would become an obstacle between herself and Thor. However, Luke seemed to think that she was disappointed because the destroyer had injured her. This was a misunderstanding, but it was also a reminder. She and Thor had a long road ahead of them still. She really didn't have to rush. Luke then brought out the Warriors 3. These 3 were a little more wretched, but that was all. In just a few minutes, they had recovered a little from their heavy injuries, at least, they no longer looked like they were about to die. Volstagg even patted Luke's shoulder. Kid, you have the heart of a warrior. Although you're weak, you're a qualified warrior. Feeling the bones in his shoulder crack, Luke said with a bitter smile, "Go easy on me, or I won't be able to keep my shoulder." Volstagg was stumped. Hogan, who had been the first to be brought out and laid down, laughed out loud. "This kid isn't bad. He's good with words." Fandral limped over with Luke's support, using his sheathed sword as a crutch. "He's not only brave, he's also smart. Without him tonight, the destroyer would have taken us down in no more than 2 minutes. In terms of brains, he can be your teacher." Luke was still smiling. "That's probably because I'm too weak and can only use my brain. A strong man like Thor can defeat all his opponents as long as he faces them head-on." When he said that, the warriors 3 nodded in unison. That's right. They all felt that this child's words were really good. Luke smiled. These 3 and Sif were Thor's friends and hardcore fans. It was better to praise Thor in front of them than to praise them. After settling the 4 of them down, Luke looked at Darcy, who was cowering behind a concrete block, and waved at her. She hesitated for a moment before she ran over. "Is there anything I can help you with?" Although she said that, her eyes kept sizing up the 4 people lying on the ground. Luke said, "It's fine, I was just telling you that you didn't have to hide. They're Thor's friends. They won't mind if you look at them." Daisy chuckled, and sure enough, her sidelong glances turned into a full scan. Fandral was the one with the most romantic soul in the group. He laughed at the remark. "Your little girlfriend?" Luke shrugged. "A friend. She's Dr. Jane's student." After hearing that, the 4 stopped paying attention. Just pretend that the Midgardians who had no combat power and had nothing to do with them didn't exist. As they were chatting, on the other end, Thor and Phil soon came to an agreement. Thor, who had recovered his divine powers, was full of confidence. He had fought in the 9 realms for countless years, and had learned many tricks of diplomacy. More importantly, Asgard was always the one that dominated. He didn't need to care too much about the other party's thoughts. All he needed to do was couch his purpose in florid language, then make the other party accept it. The fact was that he didn't have any requests of Phil, and even showed him a lot of goodwill. Apart from being blunt and not discussing anything, everything else was fine. Phil didn't have any opinions either, and even if he did, he could only hold it in. Fortunately, Thor's request was very simple. He only told them not to make trouble for Dr. Jane and the others, and offered an alliance in exchange. What could Phil say in the face of such a good thing? Of course, looking at Phil's very familiar smile, and then at a certain young man who was looking after his friends not far away, Thor casually added another name to his exemption list. After explaining this small matter, the overbearing Thor didn't give Phil a chance to argue anymore. He just said to his 4 friends, "To the Bifrost." Then, Mjolnir turned into a propeller, and Thor flew off with Dr. Jane. Everyone traded looks. "What moving PDA?" Luke called out to Phil and asked him to bring the warriors 3 and Sif over. Of course, Phil wouldn't miss the opportunity to see the Bifrost with his own eyes. He personally drove the 4 friends to the southeast. Luke took Selvig and Darcy with him as he drove their jeep over. Forget his pickup truck, there was a 25mm Viper machine gun on it. Driving the pickup in front of a group of SHIELD agents wouldn't be appropriate. Although Phil was the head of these agents, there was no need for Luke to bring trouble down on himself. They still didn't know what that baldy Sitwell was up to. By the time Phil arrived with the 4 friends, Thor had been talking to Dr. Jane for a while, and their mouths parted reluctantly. The 4 friends walked over to Thor, and he gently pushed Dr. Jane out. "Wait for me to come back." Dr. Jane slowly stepped back and nodded slightly. "I'll wait for you." When she walked out of the huge circular pattern on the ground, Thor raised his hammer. "Heimdall, take us back." As the cold wind blew, everyone held their breaths and waited for the magical rainbow bridge to descend. Especially Dr. Jane, who could finally witness a real version of the Einstein-Rosen bridge which she had been working on. Her heart pounded. Even Luke was intrigued. Thor didn't come to Earth that often, so there naturally weren't many opportunities to see the Rainbow Bridge up close. 5 seconds later, Thor, who was the focus of everyone's attention, was still standing there with his hammer raised high. His 4 friends also looked up in surprise. Thor waved the hammer again, and lightning flickered faintly, like an electric signal. "Heimdall, did you hear me? Take us back." The scene remained silent. 5 minutes later, Darcy couldn't help but yawn beside the jeep. "Maybe this Heimdall stepped out for a midnight snack," she muttered. "Or he's flirting with some barmaid." Beside her, Luke said in a low voice, "I think their bars are different from ours. It probably isn't that easy to pick up girls." "Darcy, then what do we do now? Just stand around here like idiots?" Luke pondered for a few seconds. "How about, we sit and wait?" "Darcy, good idea." The two of them then snuck into the front seats of the jeep, ready to fight a battle of attrition in comfortable positions. Luke took out a lollipop from his pocket. "Do you want one?" "Darcy, yes." The morning sun rose over the horizon, once again illuminating the wild grassland. The dew which accumulated on the tips of the blades of grass sparkled. The fresh air made one feel very good. Luke texted Selena with one hand as he stuffed a cookie into his mouth with the other. The bonfire on the side had already burned out, and only faint smoke slowly drifted out. The several small tents scattered around were relatively quiet. Further away were the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents' tents. Thor and the others had no plans to go over there. Even when Phil said he could specially set up a tent for them, no one went. Nobody liked special service agents. What made Thor and the others even more depressed was that last night, a certain crown prince had shouted for half an hour, but the legendary Rainbow Bridge never opened. After that, Thor yelled once every hour. He shouted himself hoarse until 4 o'clock in the morning, before he took a break. Actually, Thor didn't sleep the entire time. He just talked to Dr. Jane in the small tent in the circle. The 4 friends also had a tent each, and they slept inside the circle. That way, once Heimdall opened the passage, they could be transported back. Luke had provided the tents. There were a lot of these sorts of camping tents at the ranch. With just a phone call, he got the workers staying at the ranch to send a large car over. They even brought food, water, and drinks. Everyone had a bonfire barbecue party during the first half of the night, and only returned to their tents to rest after that. In Luke's opinion, it wasn't a big problem if Thor couldn't return for the time being. He had recovered his divine powers and Mjolnir, and was capable of long-range attacks and defending himself. No one on Earth could stop him anymore. This was how much of a cheat this godly heir was. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Luke chatted with Sif and the Warriors 3 again, and learned that Heimdall could see anywhere in the universe. That might be an exaggeration, but no matter where Thor was on Earth, Heimdall just needed to take a few glances to find them. So, Thor didn't have to wait around here. The only reason they were here was because this had once been a teleportation point. Heimdall didn't need to search for them and it would be easier for him to hear Thor's call here. But now that Heimdall wasn't responding, it didn't make much of a difference whether Thor waited here or went elsewhere. Thor's group was full of energetic, exuberant warriors. It wasn't practical for them to foolishly guard a deserted field. So, before everyone went to sleep, Thor had made the decision to wander the world. This was Dr. Jane's suggestion. Since Thor couldn't leave for the time being, there was no point in staying in one place. He might as well check out the North European myths about Asgard. Phil firmly promised that S.H.I.E.L.D. would cover all trip expenses. It would take quite a sum of money to build a relationship with Thor, this prince of an alien empire and future king. Of course, Phil wouldn't be stupid enough to try and save money. While chatting, Luke asked Sif and the warriors 3 to cover for him and say that the heavy weapons which had been used in the battle last night were theirs. This way, even if everyone knew that it was nonsense, they nevertheless had no choice but to accept Asgard's conclusion. The 4 friends agreed readily. After all, Luke didn't gain anything from them. Instead, he had helped the downtrodden Thor, helped the warriors 3s and Sif fight the destroyer, and finally saved Dr. Jane. Given their personalities, this request was nothing. Luke also secretly called Phil over via text to talk without anyone else knowing. He didn't say much, and only warned him, "You have to be especially careful. There's something wrong with that Baldy, Sitwell." Phil frowned. "What's going on?" Luke said calmly, "A detective's intuition. I get the feeling that this Sitwell guy is somehow hostile to you and me. It would make sense if you had killed his wife and son or cut off his future, but it makes no sense at all for him to be hostile toward me." Phil was silent for a moment before he nodded slightly. Although Luke's intuition wasn't reliable, he was willing to believe it. A detective who had killed more than 200 armed criminals on multiple occasions had reason to trust his intuition. Sometimes, a person's intuition was similar to a superpower. Also, Luke had indirectly prevented most of the agents from joining the battlefield tonight. Although Phil had been furious at the time, he now knew that Luke had done the right thing. It was just that Phil couldn't do it himself. He didn't have a close relationship with Sitwell. They just happened to be working on the same assignment this time. Phil trusted Luke more than this colleague he wasn't familiar with. After hearing Luke's warning, he pondered for a moment, then said in a low voice, "I'll make sure you're not involved at all. Don't mention this to anyone else, not even our agents." Luke nodded. "Thank you." When Sitwell ran over, he had already called out the name S.H.I.E.L.D., so it was meaningless for Phil to hide his real identity from Luke. However, Phil planned to classify Luke's deeds in this case as level 8 information. The best would be if it was made top secret at level 10. That way, it would only be seen by one person. Phil, of course, had no right to judge what level 10 information was, but Nick Fury could. Also, Thor had already said that Luke had to be protected. Then, Fury could choose to keep their interaction with Luke hidden as a trump card. The rest could only be discussed later. With that in mind, Phil took the pork roll and sausage which Luke gave to him, and returned to his tent. As he sat down in a chair in a corner and ate the food on his plate, his gaze fell on a certain shiny bald head. What was wrong with this guy? When it was almost noon, Thor and the others left. Selvig and Darcy got into their own jeep and prepared to head back. Dr. Jane and Thor went together, and Phil from S.H.I.E.L.D. took a group of people with him to be their guide and provide various services. There were no wishy-washy people here. Even in the wilderness, Dr. Jane and Darcy were hardcore researchers. Once they made a decision, they no longer tarried. Next to the mess of a concrete maze, Luke sent off one large group of people and welcomed another. At that moment, the concrete maze and hundreds of meters around it had been completely sealed off by S.H.I.E.L.D. Thor, the rich and unmanageable godly heir, didn't care much about the destroyer which he had smashed up, and directly left. Of course, S.H.I.E.L.D. wouldn't pass over this scene of an alien battle. They decisively sealed off the area for a few hundred meters. A large number of S.H.I.E.L.D. researchers wearing protective suits entered the site. Luke only took a few glances before he drove back to Shackleford. Looking at the big pieces of junk in his storage space, the corners of his mouth curled up. It was great to meet a godly heir. Last night, he had found an opportunity to talk to Thor, and had casually asked what to do about the remains of the destroyer. Thor's mind was now on returning to Asgard, and he answered absent-mindedly, "I've destroyed it, it's now a pile of junk. If you like it, take some back as a souvenir." However, a certain crown prince muttered in his heart, "I broke it into pieces. Instead of repairing it, it would be easier to build another one." The materials for making the destroyer weren't particularly rare in Asgard. The real problem was that it required Odin's handiwork. Now that Odin was in a deep sleep, what was the point of wasting effort to repair this thing? The truth was that the destroyer could be considered an outdated product. Odin had long stopped using it in battle, and had just placed it in the treasure vault as some sort of souvenir. And in Asgard's treasure vault, there were a lot of things more precious than the destroyer. It was impossible to care about it. Except for the fact that Odin might be sad, there was no benefit in taking back something that had turned into scrap metal. Thor, who was used to being rich, naturally abandoned it. Luke smiled when he heard that. If the owner didn't want it, then it belonged to no one. He didn't need to take out that large pile of remains in his storage space. This was his spoils of war when he rescued the 4 friends from the concrete maze after the battle. In order to study Asgard's magical creations, Luke had stealthily collected the remains from under the collapsed concrete blocks. However, Luke didn't want the system to judge his actions as stealing and deduct his points, so he simply communicated with the owner, Thor. In the end, the Crown Prince was as open as ever. In just a few words, the remains of the destroyer were given to Luke. More importantly, there was a system notification. System, fragments with runic symbols have been detected. Can be converted into 50,000 points or used to modify the inventory's functions. Please choose, convert points/modify inventory's functions. Luke had been through a lot, so he was calm at this prompt, as if. Although he didn't express his joy outwardly, the selection prompt was like a kitten that continued to scratch at his heart. The last time, after absorbing Blackheart's wicked thoughts, the inventory had been modified. Since then, he had discovered that he was able to operate the items in his inventory with great precision. This ability was actually very powerful, but he had only ever used it as a research tool, and in battle. Now, there was actually a chance to modify the inventory's functions again. How could he not be tempted? Fortunately, he was still more rational, and he resisted the urge to hurry up and try it. He hadn't forgotten that he had been too anxious in Houston when he chose to modify the inventory's functions. The inventory had gone on strike for half a day, leaving him with no choice but to spend the night guarding the small plane in the wasteland. Besides, the remains of the destroyer didn't belong to him. When he tested the system at the very beginning, 5 credit points had been deducted for his unlawful acquisition of $5 from someone else. Then, how much were the remains of the destroyer worth? If high-level magic items could be sold on Earth, and the system adopted the highest premium, Luke felt that his points would run into the negatives. He had no plans of finding out what it was like to have negative points. Fortunately, basic psychology and long-term experience working on cases gave him the space to perform, and his pretty good relationship with the 5 friends also made things easier. Thor didn't disappoint, and gave a perfect answer. Once again, Luke's willpower was put to the test. He chose to put this big reward off until he left Shackleford and returned to New York. The gains after exercising patience were always sweeter. It was just like when a hungry person, who originally despised fried rice, would say, "How delicious." The difference was that Luke was certain that the remains of the destroyer absolutely weren't ordinary fried rice, they were definitely delicious. The remains could be converted into 50,000 points, which was more than double the total of 20,000 points for Blackheart's wicked thoughts. He looked forward to seeing what new functions would be added to the inventory. That was Luke's biggest gain from fighting the destroyer. As for the experience and credit points, they weren't much. System: destroy the destroyer, save the residents of Shackleford and SHIELD agents. Mission accomplished. Total experience, 10,000. Total credit, 10,000. Contribution rate, 30%. EXP plus 3,000. Credit plus 3,000. Host's experience, 53,300/300,000. Credit, 81,000. He had earned 3,000 experience and credit points just by playing support. This exceeded his expectations. However, he had less than 100,000 points, and the credit points required for Thor's abilities would easily be thousands or tens of thousands. That advanced one-handed hammer proficiency cost 2 million points. Luke suddenly felt that he was too poor. His only consolation was that he had never considered using the hammer as his main weapon. Secondly, this ability was grayed out. He didn't have enough authorization to learn it. Instead, Thor's elementary abilities and lower were lit up and available. Obviously, Thor and Tony, these two heirs, were children of destiny, and could be said to have overflowing luck. Luke passed the day with complicated feelings. After seeing off Thor and the others at noon, he told Robert what happened last night. S.H.I.E.L.D. naturally made him sign a non-disclosure agreement again, but Luke didn't think it was a good idea to hide it from Robert. After all, Shackleford was where the hammer had fallen. Also, as a retired Red agent, Robert couldn't be considered an ordinary person. If he knew what was going on, he would be mentally prepared for anything that happened in the future. There was no need to stop the ranch employee Christmas tour in Houston. It would only cost a little more for them to play for a few more days. It would be dangerous if Thor and Loki were for some reason to suddenly turn back and fight it out again in Shackleford. Thus, as long as the ranch employees were willing, they could continue playing before coming back in a few days. In particular, Luke secretly asked Catherine to have Claire and Joseph keep Drax occupied for a week. If the stubborn old man came back now, he would realize that not only was there a rundown concrete maze on his ranch, but even half of the main house he lived in had disappeared. When Thor fought the destroyer, it was unfortunate that he had attacked it in the direction of the main house, which was why Dr. Jane and Darcy had arrived on the scene so quickly. When Thor successfully smashed the destroyer to pieces with a final blow, he blasted out a huge crater in front of the main house. The rocks and earth that was sent flying, along with the broken pieces of the destroyer, had brought down part of the main house dozens of meters away. The only thing that Luke was glad about was that the section that had been wrecked was the kitchen, dining room, toilet and bathroom, which didn't contain anything important. The most critical work shed was fine, and Drax's precious pickup, which was parked inside, was safe. If the car was gone, the stubborn old man would probably explode when he came back. He would make an exception and give his grown-up grandson a spanking like he was a little brat. Don't assume that wasn't possible. When Robert had discovered that the back door of the F-150 had suffered a tragic fate, his expression had turned ugly. Of course, he had never once hit Luke. But this was just a car door. Drax's temper was worse. He treasured his self-modified pickup even more. If the entire car was gone, Luke would probably be beaten up. That was the reason for Luke's complicated mood. He quickly finished dealing with the aftermath in Shackleford, then left for Houston in the afternoon with Selina. The two of them had to go over so that their families would be reassured. Luke also had to give his grandfather a little warning in advance, in case the stubborn old man exploded in anger. Before nightfall, the two arrived in Houston and found their families having dinner. Today was December 31st. The tour group was having a hotel buffet. Those who were full could go off to have fun together later. They were all adults, and could do whatever they wanted. Luke and Selina's arrival delighted everyone. Dinner was extended by half an hour, before everyone took part in the New Year Eve celebration in Houston. After a night of fun, everyone went home. Luke booked a room for himself, while Selina asked to share a room with Claire. On the first day of 2005, Luke and Selina bade farewell to their families early in the morning and boarded a flight back to New York with Gold Nugget. Back at his house in Clinton, Luke called Dustin and told him that he was back. Dustin just said that he got it, before he hung up. The moment Luke stepped into the house, he selected the option to modify the inventory. As expected, his consciousness was kicked out again. The inventory's functions were sealed once more during the upgrade. After finishing this most important task, Luke relaxed. He had done all that he could. There was no need to worry about the rest. That itch naturally disappeared, and was replaced by an indescribable sense of lightness. After making himself a pot of pu'er tea, he sat by the window and looked at the heavy clouds outside and the snow falling in New York. He was in a very good mood. He was finally home. He handed all the data he had recorded over the past few days to Little Snail for analysis. He sipped his black tea and took out some snacks, before calling for Gold Nugget. One person watched the snow while one dog watched its TV show. Both enjoyed themselves. As he watched the snow, Luke reviewed and summed up the previous battle in his mind. The destroyer really was very strong, and ridiculously so. Even the special armor-piercing shell at close range could only scratch its skin a little. Its movements were extremely fast and agile, and it was strong enough to tear down a building with its bare hands. In addition, it also had the ability to hover and fly, and had a long-range laser beam attack. This was a cheat-level boss. But Luke was able to successfully complete his experiment, so the outcome wasn't bad. By adding elementary annihilation to the Viper machine gun's ordinary armor-piercing bullet, he was able to interrupt the destroyer's light beam because the bullet damaged its transparent defense. In gaming terms, bullets with elementary annihilation dealt more damage than -1. In the end, Luke was able to deal a pretty critical hit with the Barrett sniper rifle. To put it simply, if the destroyer was a boss with 10,000 HP, Luke would have taken at least a few hundred HP from it. This was the damage from a combination of elementary annihilation and predator technology. This was an attack method which Luke had invented himself, his sleepless nights hadn't been for nothing. But that was all there was to it. Compared with Thor, who wiped out the destroyer with one big move, this attack really wasn't enough. However, Luke had enough confidence. His mental strength was only at level 40, but the power of elementary annihilation would increase as his mental strength increased. Secondly, elementary annihilation was just an ability which he had developed. It had only been half a year since he obtained this ability. He would definitely be able to obtain more abilities in the future. At that time, who knew how many more powerful abilities he would be able to develop? If he had some sort of space portal ability, he could directly throw the destroyer into some corner of the universe. Forget it. He didn't have much hope when it came to magical abilities. Until now, the only ability he had which was a little like magic was his elementary telekinesis. His other abilities were all extensions of his physical attributes. Perhaps, he would only be able to learn spatial abilities once his mental strength could twist time and space. His attitude toward this sort of ability, which he had an extremely slim chance of acquiring, was that if he got it, he could only consider himself lucky. Thinking otherwise would really depress him to death. In summary, the results were acceptable, the future was promising, and he was currently a weak chicken. Of course, this was a conclusion based on the destroyer. If it were some other superhuman on Earth who had faced the destroyer, there was a 99.99% chance that they would have been instantly incinerated on the spot. Most superhumans wouldn't survive even a few seconds in front of the destroyer. One shot, and they would be reduced to ashes. In the afternoon, Luke got busy again while Selena trained. At night, he told Selena about the destroyer and Asgard, and the two of them talked and analyzed the various details of Thor's arrival. The first day of the new year passed in a peaceful and productive manner. On the morning of January 2nd, Luke looked at his inventory, which was still being modified and couldn't be checked. It wasn't too unexpected, and instead, he was pleasantly surprised. This should be a good thing. Perhaps, the longer it took, the stronger the inventory's functions would be. After breakfast with Selena, they showed up at HQ half an hour early. After giving the snacks to Connie as usual, this female detective who was in charge of gathering and analyzing intelligence suddenly asked, "You don't know about John yet, do you?" Stumped for a moment, Luke immediately shook his head. "We went back to our hometown for the holidays. We were busy with family and things, so we only sent New Year greetings by text to everyone. We only just got back to New York yesterday." Connie nodded and pushed the box from Luke and Selena into a corner behind her. She took a bite of her cranberry cookie and said in a low voice, "You should go and say hi." He didn't have a good Christmas break. Luke was stumped. What happened? Connie looked sympathetic. He took a plane to DC on Christmas Eve to reunite with his ex-wife and daughter, but Luke and Selena both recalled that there seemed to have been a plane crash on Christmas Eve. They were shocked. His ex-wife and daughter didn't. Connie seemed to understand what they were thinking, and quickly shook her head. No, they weren't on the plane that crashed, but the plane they were on was also in the air for a while, and only made an emergency landing when it was about to run out of fuel. However, John's injuries aren't light, yet he insisted on coming to work today. Luke scratched his head. That's dangerous too. John's luck. The three people present couldn't help but sigh. Last Christmas Eve, John had gone to Los Angeles to look for his wife, only to encounter a robbery at Nakatomi Plaza. The couple had almost died. Would it be like last time? Was John's Christmas Eve jinxed? Luke and Selena pondered this, but before they could see John, Dustin got hold of them first. While Luke, Selena and Connie were talking, Dustin came in from outside and took out a cookie from the paper bag that was on Connie's table. Cranberry? Connie promptly gave him another bag. This is almond and walnut. Luke said decisively, there's plenty, take both. Dustin occasionally had difficulty choosing, so Luke simply saved him time. After a brief hesitation, Dustin put the cranberry cookie back. We'll see in the afternoon. Watching the three of them go to Dustin's office, Connie smacked her lips and said, Boss, you're very particular. As Luke had said, he always had plenty, there was enough to give everyone in the department a portion. However, on days when not everyone was in the department, there would be 30 to 50 extra portions, which were given to the detectives who worked overtime. No one deliberately took more. When they were hungry and wanted to eat, they would go to Connie and get a portion. Dustin didn't mind getting another portion, but he would rather wait until the snacks were distributed in the morning and then come back in the afternoon, since he didn't want to break the rule. Connie had nothing to say to that. It was good to have such a boss. Luke didn't close the door when he entered Dustin's office. Dustin's expression today wasn't serious. Clearly, there was a case, but it wasn't a big problem. Sure enough, Dustin poured himself a cup of hot coffee while he ate the biscuits, and said, the file on the right on my table, are you interested? Luke opened the file, which wasn't too thick, and read for a moment. A gang murder. Dustin came back with coffee and sat down to enjoy his breakfast. Yes. There was a large-scale gunfight at a nightclub last night, and more than 20 people were killed. The patrol officers didn't find any bodies. Luke curled his lip. What a professional cleanup. Dustin said, that's what the Tarasov family does in Russia. However, the person they've provoked this time is even more vicious. Luke closed the file. Should we just do a cursory investigation? Dustin nodded. No need to be too thorough in your investigation. Luke nodded. Got it. Let's go. Dustin nodded in satisfaction as Luke and Selena left the office. Even if they handled this case cursorily, it was still the Tarasov family which they had to deal with. Ordinary detectives didn't have enough poise or confidence to handle a major case like this, and would be easily embarrassed. That wasn't a problem, since only the detective involved would know. But if the case was handed to certain detectives, they might really catch the murderer. For example, a certain middle-aged bald man who had come to work today might do something this stupid. It would be troublesome if a certain abrasive detective got into a conflict with the Tarasov family and was killed. After some consideration, Dustin handed the case to Luke and Selena, whom he trusted the most. The two of them were calm and flexible, and had the confidence to face the Tarasov family. As long as the murder case was wrapped up as soon as possible, nobody would pursue it. After all, NYPD didn't need to avenge gangsters. In fact, it was all the fault of the Tarasov family's enemy for being too ostentatious. When the nightclub was at its liveliest last night, he had rushed in and started a massacre. The battle between the two parties had taken place through the bar, the disco, and to the swimming pool, leaving piles of corpses along the way as well as hundreds of witnesses. To put it bluntly, when NYPD arrived, it was a relief to find no bodies. It was good that there were no bodies. Otherwise, this incident would make national headlines. Now, no bodies. If there weren't any bodies, what was there to report? Maybe they were just shooting a movie. On this point, the gangsters were on the same page as NYPD, reporters and paparazzi were the most annoying. Luke and Selena drove to the nightclub in Brooklyn. Selena pursed her lips when she saw the four men in black suits and dark red shirts standing at the door. They've increased the number of men. Usually, there's only two. Luke hummed in acknowledgement. For that opponent of theirs, it's just a matter of pulling the trigger a little more. A single person had charged into this nightclub and killed 20 people from the Tarasov family. This kind of combat ability was quite explosive. However, the Tarasov family had a lot of people, and could afford a few deaths. The two of them stopped the car by the entrance and stood in front of a parking meter. Just as they were about to put in the money, a man in a black suit walked over with an unfriendly expression. "Move your car. Don't block the way here." Selena didn't even look at him as she stuffed 2 coins into the parking meter. Luke calmly took out his badge. "NYPD. We're here to investigate last night's shooting." The man in black frowned. "Didn't someone already come?" Luke took out a card and waved it between his fingers. "The numbers for the chief's office and internal affairs are all here. If you're not happy, you can call them to complain. Do you want them?" The man in black. No matter how powerful the Tarasov family was, they weren't bold enough to publicly tell NYPD how to handle a case, not to mention that he was just small fry watching the entrance. He didn't take the card. Instead, he turned around and walked back to the main entrance with a dark face. He spoke into his comms. Luke and Selena walked in. It was very quiet inside. When they reached the bar counter closest to the front door and crossed the yellow tape, they both noticed something unusual about the place. Although there were all kinds of things that had been knocked over, and broken wine bottles, there was no blood. Luke's sharp nose detected the smell of bleach and blood. Selena frowned. "Are they destroying the crime scene?" Luke said, "Destroying the crime scene is a much lighter crime than killing people or selling drugs. They don't care." Selena relaxed. Anyway, they weren't here to avenge the gang. If the Tarasovs wanted to clean up, they better do a good job of it. It would also be less hassle for Luke and Selena. The two of them walked slowly around the bar before heading deeper into the club. The sunglasses they were wearing were already collecting information automatically. After combining all kinds of clues, they were able to partially recreate events at the scene. The main character was the fierce person who had killed more than 20 people. Looking at the trajectory of movements and the analysis of the battle that was being projected by the sunglasses, Selena clicked her tongue and said, "This guy is pretty strong." Most of the fights happened at close range. Even though he was outnumbered, it seems he was always faster to react than the others, and hit Tarasov's bodyguards first. Luke nodded. According to some eyewitnesses, Tarasov's men were shot first in the body and then in the head. This guy is a professional. This method is commonly used by mercenaries, but they're used to preparing powerful firearms and adequate weapons. Few of them will fight alone. Selena asked, "So, is he a lone wolf or a hot-blooded killer?" Luke said, "Both. In any case, he isn't afraid of death." Selena nodded. She was already learning the close-range gun fighting skills which Luke had developed. They were similar to using daggers, and very dangerous. One wrong move, and a person could lose their life. Yet this person dared to charge into Tarasov's territory and kill more than 20 people. He truly wasn't afraid of death. No one stopped them as Luke and Selena did one round. However, Luke knew that a lot of people were secretly watching them from various corners. These people had various cleaning equipment on them. They also carried the smell of bleach and blood on them. Before the two of them entered, these people had been frantically washing the floor. They clearly didn't want to rely on NYPD to avenge their dead fellows, but no one stepped forward to stop Luke and Selena. If they pissed off NYPD, and the killer couldn't be found, NYPD might as well just take care of the Tarasov family. That was a possibility. There was no need for the Tarasov family to provoke one of America's largest law enforcement agencies. Luke and Selena left the nightclub less than 20 minutes later. The four men in black suits at the door watched as the two of them got into the car and left. Then, they used the comms to inform their comrades, the two cops are gone. You can continue with the cleanup. Selena asked, did you find any leads? Luke asked, you want to look for this super killer? Selena nodded, then shook her head. I'm just curious. I want to know who he is, but that has nothing to do with solving the case. Luke knew that she was just intrigued. Since she was learning gun fighting, she was very interested in the close combat skills used by this super killer. Luke said, if we run into him, I'll point him out to you. As he spoke, they drove east. Luke was going to the laboratory in Nassau County today. They could stay there for a few days, and he would do some post-battle analysis and research. They drove for a while, the car passing by the courthouse in Brooklyn and entering a less populated area. Bang 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 bang. There was the sound of gunshots nearby. Frowning, Luke drove the car in the direction of the gunshots. Selena was already putting on her bulletproof vest. If it was a normal shooting, she and Luke had special close-fitting bulletproof vests. However, automatic weapons were clearly being used in this gunfight, and wearing a bulletproof vest with the NYPD logo on it would effectively dispel suspicion if they got involved. As Selena put on her bulletproof vest, Luke stopped the car in a suitable location. Only then did Luke put on his bulletproof vest. Selena had already sent out a drone, and she immediately said, it's at the church. This guy is pretty fierce. As Luke buckled on his bulletproof vest, he looked at the drone feed on the screen, then gave a light exclamation of surprise and slowed down. Selena asked, what's wrong? Luke said, check if the people in the red shirts are from the Tarasov family. Selena immediately inputted the command and asked, did you notice something? The way Luke suddenly relaxed meant that he definitely knew something. Luke drew a circle with his finger, indicating for her to adjust the position of the drone. Look here. Didn't you just ask who that super killer is? Pay attention to that man in the suit attacking the Tarasov family. That's him. Selena, what? She looked at Luke suspiciously, but immediately refocused on the battle. How do you know that? Luke said, it would be strange if it wasn't him. The day before Christmas Eve, when I was sending Elena back to school, the Tarasov family sent people to a house in New Jersey owned by someone called John West, whether to silence him or for revenge. However, he killed all 12 of them. So, what happened at the nightclub and what's happening here might be a personal grudge. There was no need for a super killer like John West to incur hatred with a troublesome force like the Tarasov family unless it was a personal grudge that was hard to resolve. However, it had been more than a week since the attack which had happened before Christmas. Not only were the two sides causing a ruckus, it was getting bigger and bigger. This was probably a very deep enmity. Luke recalled the information on John West. It seemed that his wife had died of cancer not long ago. This was information that could be looked up at the hospital. John also didn't have any children. This probably wasn't about something that the Tarasovs had done to his family. Could it be that it was John who had done something to the Tarasov family? That was possible. Selena suddenly warned him, there's a sniper. Luke nodded and looked at the screen. A man on a rooftop was holding a gun. Just by looking at his posture and the silencer on his gun, one could tell that he wasn't an ordinary player. After some thought, Luke didn't say a word. He didn't even bother to contact the police front desk via the radio. The killer was up against a gang, and as a minor NYPD detective, he had nothing to do with either party. Why should he get involved? With the two detectives simply watching from the sidelines, the battle was short and intense. The man in the suit was astonishingly strong, and was the one to initiate the attacks. The Tarasov family had already lost 7 or 8 people. At that moment, a fellow driving an SUV crashed into another car and sent it spinning. John, who was standing next to the car, was caught off guard, and was sent flying as he was hit by the car. The people of the Tarasov family immediately rushed forward, preparing to get rid of this terrifying fellow. Bang! A gunshot rang out in the air. The person leading the charge jerked, and he fell to the ground with a hole in his head. Bang! A second gunshot rang out. The second person tried to dodge to the side, but blood burst from his chest and he fell to the ground screaming. Sniper, another person shouted. The 4 or 5 people who were charging forward decisively retreated and ducked behind a car, out of the sniper's firing range. John, who had been sent flying 7 to 8 meters away, struggled to get up. He crawled into a car not far away and started it up. His right hand was severely injured from that earlier collision, and he couldn't even hold his gun steady. Several of his ribs seemed to be broken. Even if he didn't run, he wasn't able to fight, and could only wait for death. How could he die before he found the guy who killed his dog? Hence, John drove off without hesitation. No one from the Tarasov family dared to chase after him. Snipers in a city environment were too dangerous. Moreover, both the sniper's shots just now had connected. He definitely wasn't a second-rate player. No one wanted to go out and become a third corpse. They could only hide behind the car and call for help. Luke and Selina, on the other hand, saw from the drone that after John drove away, the sniper on the roof immediately packed up and ran off. He had no intention of keeping the criminals occupied. What now? Selina asked. Luke smiled at her eagerness and shook his head. No, we're not Tarasov's thugs. Selina sighed regretfully. What should we do? Pondering for a moment, Luke said, let's follow him. We can talk to Mr. John West tonight, and you can spar with him. Selina chuckled. Wouldn't that be bullying him? Luke curled his lip. It was already very good of me not to get rid of both sides on the spot. Of course, when he was investigating the scene at the nightclub, he suddenly had another interesting thought. He needed to go back and consult Kincaid, the professional. The two of them quickly followed the fleeing John West, all the way to a hotel. Looking at the old building at the intersection of 2 roads, Luke narrowed his eyes. Hee. Interesting. It's this place again. Selina was also enlightened. No wonder. He really is a hitman. Luke nodded and drove away from the hotel. After they drove for a while, Selina asked, then, should we go in tonight? Luke thought for a moment, then shook his head. That's the New York branch of the Continental Hotel. We can't act too brashly. Being brash meant losing a lot of benefits, such as experience and credit points. A super killer wasn't enough to disrupt his rhythm and deal with the Continental Hotel ahead of time. Following his initial plan, Luke went to the lab. After seeing the super killer John, he now made some of his plans, which had been on standby, a priority. But this plan still lacked the most important prop, and he needed more time to do research. For the next 2 days, Luke did research and Selina trained at the laboratory in Nassau County. Luke called Kincaid and sent him a photo of John West. Is this the John you were talking about? Kincaid immediately sent an affirmative answer. Yes. Did you provoke him? Luke chuckled. What's his full name? John Wick. He's known as the Boogeyman. Of course, he wasn't called that at the beginning, Kincaid said. Luke asked, are you close to him? Kincaid, you could say that. But he could also take a mission to kill me. Luke curled his lip. In other words, you actually aren't friends at all. Kincaid scoffed. Although most of his targets are underground, he's killed many innocent people. We're not the same sort, how can we be friends? Luke nodded. Okay. By the way, did Sonia give birth to a daughter? Kincaid, it's a son. Wait, why are you asking that? Luke sighed regretfully. A little girl would be so cute. A little boy, forget it. Kincaid, get lost. After learning from Kincaid the real name of this super killer, John Wick, Luke had a clearer plan in his head. The super killer John Wick didn't come out after entering the Continental Hotel. He was clearly recuperating. According to Little Snail's analysis, he had extraordinary reflexes and he was extremely proficient in close combat. However, he wasn't much stronger than an ordinary person. He would need some time to recover from his injuries. To some extent, Hitman John was similar to a weak version of Daredevil, but his methods were more professional, ruthless, and direct. He was good at using all kinds of firearms, and his lethality wasn't something that Lawyer Matt could compare with. However, this was a small matter. The really important thing was that the modification of Luke's inventory was finally completed on the second day. Luke, who was working, immediately dropped what he was holding and focused on his inventory. The system was as awesome as ever, and didn't give him any explanations at all. After a simple test, Luke found that his control over the items in his inventory hadn't changed much. Where it had taken him 5 seconds before to assemble a gun in his inventory, it now still took him over 4 seconds. This upgrade didn't match the 50,000 points that he had gotten in exchange for the destroyer's remains. But Luke quickly kicked up a fuss, until Daddy's system gave him a hint. After repeated mental efforts, a separate space was created from the original inventory space. The inventory remained unchanged, but it was divided into 2 parts. The original inventory took up 999 cubic meters, while the new independent space was only 1 cubic meter in size. Of course, like the inventory, it didn't have a fixed shape, and its interior was illuminated by natural light. The first thing Luke did was to put a laptop in it as a test. Then he saw the clock on the laptop continue ticking. Luke was stunned for a moment, before he stuffed in all sorts of other things, like food, water, daily necessities, and in the end, even a few bugs, fish, shrimp, and birds. A moment later, he silently sat in the living room with a cup of tea in his hand. His mind was in turmoil. The modification this time was completely beyond his expectations. However, if his guess was correct, then the modification this time was truly very important. Everything needed to be verified with experiments, and many experiments required time. He had to suppress his impatience and verify the attributes of this small space bit by bit. It wasn't until night had fallen that he finally composed himself and tried his best to resist the lure of the changes in his inventory as he returned to work as normal. On the third day, early on January 5th, Dustin summoned Luke and Selena to the police station. After telling Luke to close the door, Dustin asked, "Do you have any leads on the case you were investigating?" Luke raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong?" Dustin wasn't a fickle-minded person. He had just said to close the case as soon as possible, but now he was asking if there were any leads. Something must have happened. Dustin tossed a file at him. Luke caught it and flipped through a few pages before he handed it to Selena. "HQ is planning to merge this case with the previous one." Dustin nodded. "That's right. It's another mass murder of gangsters, but there was no one to clean up the bodies this time. HQ has to take care of it even if we don't want to. If this goes on, it'll cause panic among the public." Luke said, "But this wasn't done by the same person, how can we combine them?" Dustin, huh? Luke rarely spoke nonsense when it came to handling cases. Dustin was well aware that Luke only spoke when he was sure of things. Luke said, "There are some things that I can only talk about here." The nightclub belongs to the Tarasov family, and on Christmas Eve, the Tarasov family already engaged in an intense conflict with that hitman from the nightclub. However, the location of this fight was in New Jersey, and there were no bodies, so the New Jersey police didn't file a report. Dustin nodded and didn't ask Luke how he knew that, nor did he worry about the New Jersey police. Luke had been working on the case for 3 days, so it wasn't strange for him to learn more information through his connections. Dustin wasn't interested in probing into his subordinate sources of information. In fact, the shooting at the church near the Brooklyn courthouse 2 days ago was a conflict between the two parties, Luke continued. So, this is actually between the hitman and the Tarasov family. And this, he pointed at the file that Selina was reading. The Irish gang in Hell's Kitchen has nothing to do with either side. The only thing that's similar is the number of deaths and the killer's violent methods. No one saw the assailant, however, so it might not be the same person. Dustin frowned. Are you taking this case? Luke nodded. Of course. It's very likely we won't be able to find anything in these cases. If someone starts pointing fingers, we'll just take the blame. In any case, we don't need a promotion. Hearing that, Dustin smiled. Rubbish. I'll make it a public case, and you can investigate whomever you want. If you crack it, the credit's yours. If you don't, it's NYPD's problem, and won't fall on your heads. I'm more familiar than you with how this works. He paused for a moment, before continuing, it's fine if you don't want to be promoted, but don't get complacent. Some people are targeting me, and might come after you for it. Avoid taking any blame if you can. Luke blinked. Boss, thank you. He knew Dustin wouldn't let him take the fall, but it was fine to do so every now and then. Dustin said impatiently, cut the crap and get to work. Luke and Selina stood up. When he opened the door, he heard a voice behind him. There's no end to the cases. Don't work too hard, and take care of your own safety. This time, Luke simply smiled and waved goodbye. When they went out, they ran into John McClane, who had just entered the hall. The abrasions on this fellow's face weren't serious, but there was the obvious smell of medicine as he approached. Luke and Selina greeted him, and they chatted for a while. Christmas Jinx McClane had once again encountered terrorists. What was even more annoying was that the bunch he had run into this time also weren't real terrorists, and were after money Aegon. Of course, in terms of how they operated, these people were no different from the criminals in Nakatomi Plaza. John still managed to take them down even without Luke around this time, but his injuries were a little more serious. Dustin had planned to give him a month's leave, but it was less than a week before the guy got into an argument with his ex-wife. John thus flew back alone. Luke and Selina looked at each other speechlessly. This macho man killed a bunch of soldiers turned criminals and saved his ex-wife, but in the end, they had a falling out. There probably truly was no hope for a marriage that couldn't be saved even after a life-saving rescue. Luke and Selina could only console John McClane, and they said they would buy him a drink when they were free. They then left for last night's crime scene. When they left the parking lot, Selina couldn't help but sigh. How did he and his wife get together back then? Luke said, it's easy to get married, but you have to persevere after that. I can only say that they do love each other, but they can't get along. Selina nodded thoughtfully, then turned to the file in her hand. A moment later, she exclaimed in surprise. Who did this? This is so ruthless. Luke said, John Wick is still holed up in the Continental Hotel. It can't be him. Let's talk about it at the scene. For the past 2 days, they had been keeping an eye on the Continental Hotel. John was recuperating, and hadn't come out at all. That was the reason why the two of them had immediately confirmed that the new case wasn't the work of John Wick. Selina said, the MO isn't right either. The assailant used intense firepower through the window and turned more than 10 Irish gang members into thieves. This is very different from John Wick's MO. This is what mercenaries do. Luke took some time to look at the CCTV images and nodded. It's a typical mercenary MO. It's simple and straightforward. What's more troublesome is that he didn't clean up the bodies. That's why it has left a bad aftertaste. It would be strange if NYPD wasn't nervous about such a massacre. When they arrived at the crime scene in Clinton, Luke looked at the warehouse by the river. He got out of the car and said, "These guys are smart. They hid here at the docks. It's possible that they snuck over here by boat. No wonder I hadn't seen them recently." Selina shook her head and sighed. Why all the trouble? These Irish gangsters were the ones they had beaten up before. It was a pity that while they had managed to escape these poetic kills, they hadn't managed to escape the rain of bullets from a battlefield slaughter. These unlucky sods were even still wearing bandages and plaster as they lay in pools of blood. They could have gone into hiding to recuperate in New Jersey or something, but snuck back here. They had definitely been up to something, but now they were dead. Selina roasted these unlucky sods in her heart. They flashed their badges at the police officers outside and entered the scene. The two of them were shocked to see the mess inside. As Selina avoided the debris and blood on the ground, she asked, how many bullets were fired? The file only contained a preliminary report, and the exact number of bullets hadn't been tallied up. She had initially thought that the forensic scientists were slacking off, but she now understood that it was because they were too busy. The number of bullet holes which Luke's sunglasses scanned continued to increase, but soon slowed down. He looked at the number and curled his lip. More than 300 shots. Selina said, there were a dozen gang members, and each was shot several times. So, the assailant fired more than 500 bullets in one go? Does he think this is the Middle East? Luke said, the assailant used a 5.56 mm rifle. With that firepower, he was really treating this as a war. He shook his head. This was Manhattan, New York, the center of the world. Doing something like this would cause big trouble. Selina said, is that why we ran into a super killer, and now a violent mercenary? The AI program had reconstructed part of the scene, showing that the assailant had most likely acted alone, hence her words. Luke left the warehouse and walked toward where the assailant had been. After all, anything can happen in Manhattan, New York. As he said this, he couldn't help but think of a particular scenario. Manhattan was the treasured feng shui land favored by the Free Extraterrestrial Demolition Company. Only guns had been used in the last few years. When the energy cannons and alien warships joined the demolition company in the future, it would be lively. After patrolling the area, Luke didn't find much. The assailant had attacked from outside the warehouse. They were by the river, and the strong wind had long blown away all sense. He wasn't in a hurry. There were many cases where haste made waste. What was most important was time and a meticulous investigation. They returned to HQ and went to Elsa. After listening to what they needed, Elsa just told them to wait for a moment. After making a call, she called them over to take a look at her computer less than half an hour later. Entering the database, she quickly opened up a few numbered documents. Based on the characteristics you provided, I had Liz check similar cases in the past 2 years, and found these cases from the second half of last year. Take down the file numbers, you can check them yourself when you go back. Luke said with a smile, we're already here. Boss, why don't you give us an analysis? Elsa rolled her eyes at him, but she knew that he wanted everyone to keep in contact so that they wouldn't drift apart. Alright, since you brought me snacks. She briefly summarized the common points in the cases before she said, the cases happened at different times, and not just in New York City, which is probably why no one made the connection. But you're right, it might have been done by the same group. Luke said, maybe it's just one person. Elsa was stunned. One person. She couldn't help but look at the files on the computer screen. The death toll was more than 20 people. Could this be done by one person? Huh, wasn't there a person in front of her right now who could take down a dozen people on his own? She simply nodded. Apart from the common points you mentioned, they also have one clear thing in common: the Mexican cartel, the Irish gang, and the Dogs of Hell are big, long-term players in the drug trade, and engage in both mutual competition and cooperation. After a pause, she suggested, you can investigate from this angle. After all, it isn't strange for drug traffickers to have provoked someone. They're too dirty, and have many enemies. It's just that most victims don't have the power to take revenge. Luke nodded. They would be in trouble if they provoke someone more unreasonable than they are. Elsa nodded. What Luke said made sense and was the most likely scenario. After hearing this simple and precise analysis, Luke got up and stopped taking up Elsa's time. Dinner tonight? Liz can join us, and we can talk about what everyone did for Christmas. Elsa pointed at him. You can scram now. Send me the time and place. I'll let Liz know. Luke and Selena laughed and left. Elsa didn't get a holiday. She had worked overtime through Christmas, and hadn't gone back to Miami at all. A certain someone's words were simply rubbing salt into the wound for this old iron lady. After leaving the intelligence department, Luke received a call from Dustin, then went straight to the 15th precinct. HQ had just received the news that someone survived last night when the Irish gang was wiped out, but that person had escaped. Now, this lucky man named Elliot Grote had brought a lawyer to the 15th precinct to turn state's evidence. Luke and Selena weren't surprised at all. What happened at the police station often contradicted the normal logic of most people. Since most people didn't commit any crimes, they would naturally think that there was something wrong with the brains of criminals who entered the police station themselves. While there were indeed many who had a screw loose, many more had practical considerations. It was just that this was something law-abiding citizens couldn't understand. Was this Elliot Grote trying to turn over a new leaf? Luke simply observed him for a moment from the doorway before he closed the door. This person's heart was filled with fear, despair, foreboding, and many other emotions, but there was no remorse. He was an irredeemable criminal. He just wanted to live, and had no intention of going back on his word. Shutting the door, he looked at the two familiar faces standing by the door, and said helplessly, Foggy, Karen, why are you taking this case? Foggy and Karen looked at each other, and it was Foggy who said, last night, we were playing pool at the bar, and Grote approached us and told us about the Irish gang being wiped out. Luke frowned. Last night? Foggy hesitated, then whispered, this is just a conversation between friends, right? Luke smiled and said in a low voice, of course. It won't appear in any official records. Foggy explained in an even lower voice. In fact, Grote really had no choice but to come to the police station today. He'd been shot last night when he'd gone to find Matt and Foggy. He'd collapsed after only a few words with them. Foggy and the others had to take him to Metropolitan General Hospital, but it wasn't long before the assailant arrived and pursued Grote and Karen out of the hospital. After the two of them had been lucky enough to escape, Foggy and the others had no choice but to send Grote to the police station for his protection. Luke looked Karen up and down in surprise. Are you okay? She was only a girl in her 20s, and it was already very brave of her not to piss her pants when she was being chased and shot at, but she actually managed to escape with Grote. Was she also a potential female warrior? Karen was a little tired, but she was in good spirits. She didn't look like she'd been shot at last night. Karen shook her head. I'm fine. After some hesitation, she explained in a low voice, I think that the person was only after Grote. I wasn't his target. Luke asked, his? Karen nodded. I saw the man who was after Grote. White male, about 35 years old, with a buzz cut, a fierce appearance, and a strong physique. Luke asked, does that mean the assailant was captured by hospital cameras? Foggy shook his head. No. When he entered the hospital, there was a large area with malfunctioning wires and lights. Karen's probably the only person who had a clear look. Luke nodded. Got it. Karen, don't tell anyone about this for now. If the police ask you, just say that you were frightened and can't remember anything. Karen couldn't help but glance at Foggy. Foggy, a Columbia Law graduate, explained at once, it's perfectly normal for a person not to remember anything when they're frightened. You don't have to say anything, but you can also give a statement at the right moment, and it wouldn't be a false statement. He paused, and looked at Luke and Selena awkwardly. Was it too much for him to discuss such petty tricks in front of two detectives? Luke, on the other hand, nodded and said, this case is a little tricky. Karen had better not mention it before there are any major developments. Even if she does, we might not necessarily be able to catch the suspect. Grote should have seen the assailant, right? Foggy grimaced. He said he was frightened, and can't remember what he looks like. Luke spread his hands with a smile. Look at how skilled he is. Where's Matt? Before Karen could say anything, Foggy got an uncomfortable look on his face and forced a smile. He's not feeling well. He's resting at home. Luke's heart skipped a beat when he saw Foggy's expression. That excuse sounded familiar. Was Lawyer Matt injured again? However, he didn't press Foggy for an answer. He simply nodded and said, this case isn't simple. The Irish gang may not be the only victims of the massacre. You have to watch your own safety. Foggy, what's going on? Luke said, after this is personal talk, okay? Foggy reflexively said, okay. I've checked the files. Several gangs have been attacked in similar ways in the past 6 months, and more than 20 people have died. However, the cases happened in New Jersey and Nassau County, so no one connected them, he said. Foggy's eyes widened. What? Don't tell anyone about this. Just keep it to yourselves. Luke nodded. I'll let you know if there's any progress on this case, but make sure you stay safe. Foggy grimaced. But we're representing Grote. Luke looked at him quietly. Then be careful. Don't die so easily. Foggy, dude, why are you being so serious? My legs are shaking. Just then, a black detective walked over. When he saw the 4 of them, he greeted them one by one. Are you discussing the community reconstruction plan again? Luke chuckled. Hello, Detective Mahoney. Those kids are probably happily doing volunteer work right now. I'm relieved. Mahoney laughed, too. Sooner or later, they'll understand that it's a wonderful and righteous thing. Luke nodded. But I'm here about the Irish gang today. Mahoney glanced at Foggy, who didn't say anything, then said, HQ wants to take the case. Luke shook his head. It's just a matter of understanding the situation. That's why the 2 of us are here. We won't interfere. As he spoke, he glanced at the interrogation room. Mahoney understood that Luke was making it clear that he wasn't going to take the lead in the case. At most, he would just learn a little more about the situation on the side. He was also relieved. Luke and Selena had a good reputation in the Clinton area, and Mahoney was also part of NYPD. It wasn't hard to check their identities as detectives. Luke really didn't want to get into a conflict with these 2 from HQ. The 15th Precinct's image at HQ was already bad enough, Mahoney didn't want to be blacklisted as well. With that confirmed, everyone followed Detective Mahoney into the interrogation room. After entering the interrogation room, Luke and Selena simply stood in a corner and silently watched the others interact with Grote. Mahoney was a capable young detective who, at the age of 26, had just been promoted to sergeant. More importantly, he was one of the few detectives in the 15th Precinct who wasn't corrupt, and he had a hard time at the department. Like Foggy and Matt, he was a local who had grown up in the Clinton area, and had a different kind of affection for the place. It was also because of this that he could maintain his bottom line and not become a corrupt police officer. With Foggy and Mahoney working together, Grote quickly lost his composure and revealed a lot of important information. For example, before this, he hadn't mentioned that there had been a rumor going around the gang members that the assailant was acting alone. Like what Luke said, the person had also attacked other gangs. This Grote was indeed dishonest. It made sense that the assailant wanted to kill him. After more than 10 minutes of questioning, Mahoney went out to answer a call. When he came back, he tossed Grote a prison uniform and threw him into a separate holding cell as a sort of protective custody. Mahoney then motioned for Foggy and Luke to follow him to a corner, and he whispered, "The assistant district attorney said he's coming over to take over the case." "You." Luke said, "We won't interfere." Mahoney looked at Foggy immediately. "Once he proposes a deal, whatever it is, you should agree, otherwise, they'll remember it, and things won't go smoothly for your firm after this." Foggy, "Got it. But what do you know about the assailant?" Mahoney looked at Luke and Selina. "We only learned about this case this morning. We don't know much about the details," Luke said with a smile. Both Foggy and Karen had strange looks on their faces when they heard this. Luke, however, didn't think it was anything to be embarrassed about. He didn't have much of a relationship with Mahoney, so of course, he couldn't casually reveal important information to Mahoney. Mahoney sighed. Initially, the environment in the Clinton area was much better after the community reconstruction. Now that such a bloody incident has happened, I'm afraid everyone's impression of the Clinton area is that it's still Hell's Kitchen. Everyone had nothing to say to that. Mahoney sighed and continued, "Originally, when people hear the word hero, they think of Batman. When they see Batman and the other vigilantes beating up the bad guys on the news, they're as excited as the Yankees hitting a home run. Now, I'm afraid everyone will have some concerns about heroes. The streets are flowing with the blood of these B***stars because of this guy. The residents don't want another bunch of copycats. Foggy grimaced. Unfortunately, the number of copycats will only increase. Black Mask, Big Daddy, Hit Girl, Smiley Face, Black Cat, how many of them are there? Although most of the copycats are just cosplayers who are a little nuts, these vigilantes aren't doing anything for peace in New York right now, but are creating more security issues." Mahoney shook his head. At that point, he lowered his voice. "We are now divided into two factions. One faction believes that these vigilantes have helped a lot and saved the police force a lot of effort. The other faction feels that they aren't any different from those criminals and should be arrested." When he said that, his enthusiasm waned. As a police officer, if he wasn't placing his hopes on these vigilantes, then he was out to arrest them. It really made him feel helpless. At that moment, he saw two people come in, and he pursed his lips. "The people from the DA are here. I've got work to do. Foggy, you can go talk to them yourself." Everyone looked over and saw a man and a woman in standard work attire walking over. The person in the lead was a Latin American woman in her 40s, and a black man in his early 30s was one step behind her. Foggy's expression changed, and he turned back to Karen. "How do I look? There's no problem, right?" Karen looked him up and down and nodded. "No problem. Why are you suddenly nervous?" "That's Samantha Reyes, the DA boss." Luke shook his head. "Foggy, you better prepare yourself. I'm afraid she's not here to negotiate with you." Foggy paused in tidying himself up. "Huh?" Luke said, "I heard that she's ruthless at humiliating others. Also, 3 assistant district attorneys were replaced in 2 years, they were all fired after making mistakes." Foggy's face fell. "I've heard that too, thank you very much." A person with this kind of reputation didn't sound like someone who was easy to deal with, not to mention that the other party was the district attorney herself. Even though he said that, Foggy calmed his thoughts and walked over with a smile. 5 minutes later, Selina held back her laughter as she whispered into Luke's ear, "That fatty Foggy is really bold. He even dares to talk back to the district attorney." And he even called the federal prosecutor to ask about it. Huh, Reyes's face is turning black. Luke nodded. The matter's still up in the air. That was true. Foggy greeted her with a smile, but Reyes had no interest in listening to him introduce himself. After interrupting him, she instructed her assistant to take Grote away. That was right, she had given her assistant the order, and hadn't spoken to Foggy, as if she was certain that this small lawyer would never dare oppose her. In the end, she was slapped in the face. Foggy sensed that the woman was trying to bypass him and take Grote away, and immediately fought back. He raised the legal clause that the DA had no right to interfere with witness protection, and threatened to bring up this violation with the federal prosecutor. Reyes's expression at the time was extremely interesting. Not only was her face dark, it was also full of confusion. She didn't expect that there really would be a lawyer rash enough to dare clash with her. Her actions were definitely against the rules, but most junior lawyers didn't dare clash with the DA, or they would be tormented by the DA's office until they went crazy. American lawyers, the DA and the police tended to be more cooperative than confrontational with each other. Many big lawyers weren't just good at defense, but had a close relationship with both sides. They could easily do things that other lawyers couldn't. For example, where a small lawyer couldn't bail someone out of custody, a big lawyer could. Where a small lawyer couldn't reach a plea bargain with the DA, a big lawyer could. With enough money, a big lawyer could easily get a client out of the police station and scot-free after going through the DA. And it was completely legal. On the contrary, if a lawyer offended the DA, he would be blacklisted by the district attorney's office, and the lawyer would have to exhaust all his energy in every case. Not to mention, most district attorneys had close connections with the police department. After all, one party arrested suspects while the other convicted them. It wasn't unusual for police officers to switch to working for the DA. Foggy acting like this hence didn't make sense. To describe Foggy's behavior another way, he was courting death. But Luke admired him. Foggy was a good man with a bottom line and a sense of justice. And this district attorney Reyes was anything but pure. Although a person who could sit in that position wouldn't be pure, Reyes's motive for participating in this case definitely wasn't clean. If Foggy was a blank piece of paper, Reyes was a pile of mud at the very least, if not a pile of sh*t. But no matter how pure Foggy was, he could never be a blank piece of paper. Reyes's heart hence couldn't even compare with sh*t, and she stank. Luke also made a note of this district attorney. If Foggy and the others were dealt with in the future, he wouldn't mind looking into Miss Reyes's black history and prodding her. Foggy's firm was useful to him, while Miss Reyes was worthless. It made sense. After being called out, Reyes very reluctantly allowed Foggy and Matt to participate in the case. She could settle scores later, but she really didn't have the guts to use force now. She was going to be a big shot, she didn't want to be pulled down with Foggy. Luke didn't get involved in what happened next. He simply waved goodbye to Foggy and left with Selena. The show was over, so it was time for them to leave. He wasn't afraid of Reyes. The DA wasn't the head of NYPD, after all, and had nothing to do with him. But Luke had learned what he needed to know. He wasn't interested in getting involved in Reyes's business. He could call Foggy when he had time later and find out everything. Foggy was unlikely to keep a secret from a friend for the sake of the overbearing Reyes. After they left the hospital, Luke called Elizabeth and asked her to check the surveillance cameras near Metropolitan General Hospital last night to see if they could find the suspect that Karen had described. If she had any information, she would let Luke know at dinner tonight. Elizabeth asked, "Is Selena the one cooking? Her dishes and desserts are amazing. Even in my dreams, I want to eat them." Luke glanced at Selena and said decisively, "Yes, I guarantee that she'll have made them by the time you arrive." After Luke hung up, Selena couldn't help but ask, "Can you admit that you're the one who makes everything? This is hard for me." The main thing was that she was only responsible for eating. She was embarrassed when bringing up the pig swill that she made. However, Elizabeth frequently praised her for her cooking skills and even said that she wanted to learn from her. Fortunately, Elizabeth was too busy to learn. Otherwise, Selina wouldn't know how to react. Luke shrugged. You're responsible for pressing the buttons on the kitchen appliances today, so you can be considered to have made the food. Selina, your words make sense, I actually can't retort to that. After a simple lunch, the two of them went to look for private surveillance cameras near the Metropolitan Hospital. They tried their best to get hold of surveillance footage from key locations after the crime last night. Elizabeth could only check surveillance cameras installed by the police. There weren't many of them, and they were conspicuously marked. Anyone with just a little bit of professional knowledge would try their best to avoid them. The truth was that the police surveillance cameras were specially placed around sensitive locations such as banks, fast food restaurants, and jewelry shops, as a deterrent against would-be criminals and to keep the crime rate down. The possibility of the assailant appearing in police footage wasn't high. However, the private surveillance cameras scattered in various discreet corners were difficult to avoid. They might have captured him. As long as Luke brought the surveillance footage back, Little Snail would transfer it to the database for analysis. At 5 in the afternoon, they returned to their home in the Clinton area. Luke was responsible for processing the ingredients, while Selina was ultimately responsible for putting them into the smart kitchenware. The two of them spent less than half an hour cooking dinner, it was more that they were resting and chatting, and made dinner in passing. But Little Snail then sent out a notification, "Sir, a possible target has been identified." So soon. Luke was pleased. You're getting smarter, Little Snail. Do you want to change your name in the future? Little Snail, what name? Luke asked, Running Snail. Little Snail, there is no benefit in changing names in terms of efficiency. Sir, please quickly give an order. Luke said, all right, let's stick to Little Snail. Thank you, sir. Should I display the information on the possible target? Luke said, okay, pull it up. Let me see who it is. When he saw the familiar middle-aged man on the virtual screen, he was stunned. Frank Castle. Little Snail, are you sure? Little Snail immediately threw up another virtual image. This is the image from a surveillance camera outside the hospital before the attack last night. Luke looked at Frank Castle, who had a long satchel on his back and was walking with his head down. Although the person on the surveillance footage was covered up, Little Snail had a very effective identification program. Many factors were taken into consideration to produce an 89% match. The long satchel Frank was carrying clearly contained guns. When he recalled that the assailant had used a shotgun in the hospital last night, Luke couldn't rule out Frank Castle even if he wanted to. Moreover, this guy was an army veteran. These two attacks matched his MO. What a surprise, Luke murmured. Selina also knew that Luke was looking for Frank Castle. When she saw the man in the picture, she frowned as she stuffed a cake into her mouth. What are you going to do? Frank Castle had caused a huge stir last night, and the DA was now on this case. He was actually in a very dangerous situation. If things went wrong, all of NYPD would be hunting him. Luke had Little Snail put away the virtual screen, and he returned to the living room with a plate of desserts. I'll go out in the next few days to look for this old army comrade of Robert's. If possible, I'll tell him to leave New York as soon as he can. The people Frank had killed were gang members who were either drug traffickers or used brutal methods. Luke certainly wasn't going to condemn him for that. However, it was too easy for Frank to be targeted if he stayed in New York. He had to be sent away. Elsa and Elizabeth arrived in the same car an hour later. Only Elsa got drunk at dinner that night. The other three had just returned after going home for the holidays and enjoying themselves. Only Elsa, who remained in New York on her own and worked through Christmas, needed to find a way to relax. Elizabeth then drove Elsa home. What surprised Luke was that Elizabeth had also discovered traces of Frank Castle. However, it wasn't near the hospital. Instead, Frank had appeared on surveillance cameras near the warehouse where the Irish gang had been wiped out. Luke didn't say anything, but asked Elizabeth to keep this information a secret. Elizabeth didn't ask any questions and agreed readily. She trusted Luke completely. Otherwise, she wouldn't be so conscientious when it came to a private matter like this. At 10 in the evening, Luke and Selena put on their special stealth suits and left the house via the underground tunnel. The first thing the two of them did was to go to Lawyer Matt's house. Selena didn't go in as Luke entered through a window. Looking at Matt, who had a pinched expression from where he had withdrawn into a corner, he sighed. "Did someone beat you up again?" Matt shifted, then immediately relaxed. "Puncher?" Luke nodded. "What happened?" The Clinton area had been rather peaceful recently. Apart from Frank Castle massacring the Irish gang and chasing one of them to the hospital last night, there had been no activity from the Hand or Kingpin. It could be said that Luke had sent Lawyer Matt's old adversary packing, so why did it look like Matt had been beaten up? Matt shook his head and managed to get to his feet. Luke realized that the guy was listing as he moved, as if he didn't have any balance. He walked over, picked Matt up, and put him on the sofa. He looked at the results of the analysis projected on his lenses and asked, "A concussion?" "Matt, you could say that. I went out last night, ran into someone, and got shot." Luke frowned. "Who did it?" Matt said, "The guy who killed the Irish gang. I followed him around the Metropolitan Hospital last night. We fought and he shot at my head." Luke had a strange look on his face. He hadn't expected that reply. "Then why aren't you dead?" Matt grimaced. "I don't think he wanted to kill me. He just wanted me to stop bothering him." "He shot you in the head just to stop you from bothering him?" Luke sweated a little. This army comrade of Robert's didn't seem to have a good temper. Was he really not worried about blowing up Lawyer Matt's head? Matt said, "He knew my helmet was bulletproof. Otherwise, he could have killed me with one shot after he knocked me down, but he didn't. He just left." Speechless for a moment, Luke asked, "Then why were you looking for him?" Matt said, "If he messes around like this, he'll wreck the security that has just started to improve. People from elsewhere will also think that Hell's Kitchen is still that chaotic and violent place. I can't let him do whatever he wants. Also, his methods are too violent. I don't think it's the right way to deal with these people. Those traffickers should have a chance to change their ways." Hearing that, Luke realized that it was a conflict of views. In this respect, he was actually on Frank Castle's side. It was a good thing that Matt didn't know what Luke had done in the guise of his other aliases, or he would also try to change Luke's mind. Luke also had no interest in convincing Matt. A life philosophy was worthless. For the sake of money, many people would cross their bottom line. Although it was worthless, it could still make two people who had no conflict of interest become mortal enemies, even if they weren't bad people. That was why Luke had created so many aliases, and none of them had anything to do with each other. It should be easier for Batman to win Matt's approval, and easier for V to win Damon and Mindy's friendship. These superheroes who were far more powerful than ordinary people all had their own pride and values. It was very difficult to make them act against their views. Luke had always been a pragmatist. He didn't care about these people's views. His views were more like that of normal people: if the big baddie died, they deserved it. If the little baddie died, they were unlucky. Ordinary people and good people could help as they saw fit. That was all. He abided by many rules, but he wouldn't let himself be constrained by them. That was because he had a supervisor that was far better at getting to the heart of a matter than ordinary laws, the system. Many heroes didn't dare kill people casually because they were afraid that they would grow out of control. Luke wouldn't. Recently, he even speculated that the way the system judged the host's behavior very likely had to do with the host's own views. Take for example if a regular police officer attacked Luke, only for Luke to kill him. If Luke had deliberately created this situation, his points would be deducted. Although this had never happened before, the system had given him a faint warning when he had thought of this possibility very early on. If Luke happened to hit a police officer with a stray bullet during a fight, the system wouldn't deduct any points. That was because Luke hadn't intended to harm the police officer. To put it simply, the system's criteria for deducting points had nothing to do with the law, but Luke's own heart. The system itself was just a program, and could only talk in terms of logic and rules. To play the law and escape blame, money was all that was needed. To play with the system that was connected to his soul, however, was really too difficult. Luke had no interest in messing around with such a troublesome matter. In any case, he had never thought of killing innocents. Hence, he didn't feel conflicted in front of Matt, and just treated him as a good person. After pondering deeply for a moment, he shook his head and said, "This matter is more complicated than you think. Rest well and recover." Matt said nothing. Sensing his emotions, Luke didn't say anything else. He himself was also a stubborn person, even though there weren't many things that could make him express it. But when he acted stubborn, it was useless no matter what others said. In some ways, Matt was no less stubborn than he was. There was no point in saying more. Soon, Luke left Matt's house. He had just come by to take a look and make sure Matt wouldn't die from serious injuries. Matt only had a concussion. Given his resilience, he would be fully recovered in 3 or 5 days. There was nothing to worry about. After Luke walked out of Matt's door, his figure became a transparent, distorted shadow. After leaping across a few buildings, he met up with Selena and they moved through the Clinton area at night. The search for Frank Castle wasn't going well. Luke and Selena spent 2 nights searching around the gangs, but didn't find Frank. On the 3rd night, Luke left the house without Selena. Selena wasn't like him, and couldn't sleep for just 2 hours every day. She still needed to undertake all sorts of training to strengthen herself. It would be best if she only went out once every 2 or 3 days. Luke didn't wear his armor when he went out alone. He just disguised himself and drove around in a rented car. He was searching for Frank, and didn't need to go too fast. If he slowed down, he might be able to find more clues with sharp nose and elementary sound wave. He started his search in Clinton and then moved to the upper city district in the north, then moved from the south to the north through Harlem, East Harlem, Manhattan Mall, and Washington Heights, before he repeated the circuit again. Stealing and robbery were common in New York at night. Robbing passers-by and 24-hour supermarkets at night was what many hooligans did every day. When Luke encountered some petty theft and robbery, he threw out one or several small medals in passing. This thing was better than a gun or a throwing knife in a situation where he wasn't aiming to kill. He could even use some evasive techniques to knock down these hooligans outside their line of sight. That way, Luke wouldn't be too conspicuous and wouldn't leave any trace of having done a good deed as he accumulated experience and credit points one after another. Even so, Luke was still able to earn 100 experience and credit points in 2 or 3 hours. These points were mainly from Harlem. There was a big problem with security in this area. It didn't have a nickname like Clinton's Hell's Kitchen, but it had just as many cases of petty theft and fights. For the last few days, Luke had been in the mood to hunt 2-bit creeps, so he would definitely come here. 100 experience and credit points a night wasn't a lot, but if he came every day, he could earn at least 3,000 to 4,000 experience and credit points a month. That wasn't a small amount. More importantly, there was no end to the experience and credit points here. It was impossible to seriously injure all the hooligans through these small scuffles. It wasn't to the point of slapping a person for running a red light, for example. After a few days, a new urban horror legend began to spread in Harlem. Many hooligans said that they had bumped into a ghost at night. Furthermore, this ghost was inclined toward justice, and would knock them out when they were stealing or robbing. Every time, they would wake up after a few minutes. Their heads would ache a little and they would feel a little faint, but they weren't injured. It was as if they had been possessed by a ghost. Of course, these people actually had small red dots on their heads from where they had been knocked out by little metal balls. However, because of the lack of personal hygiene, these people didn't notice the red dots, which made it seem more like a ghost story. Luke wasn't clear on this matter, mainly because this rumor was too low-level for little Snail to collect information on. That night, he went to Harlem as usual. When the car drove past a small street, he frowned and looked at the fake phone on the dashboard, which was feeding him images from the external surveillance camera. He adjusted the camera and saw a person sitting on a fire escape on the third floor, holding a large professional camera and clicking away. What Luke hated the most was being photographed, so he didn't like people snapping away nearby. The surveillance program was very sensitive toward these sorts of covert photographers, which was why it had detected this person. Besides, this was New York after 8 o'clock on a winter night. There were no street lamps on this street. If the flash wasn't used on ordinary cameras, they wouldn't be able to capture anything. Professional paparazzi. Luke's frown deepened. After parking the car in a small alley not far away, his expression changed. He picked up his backpack and walked into the apartment building on the side. The person on the third floor put down the camera, picked up the vodka on the side, and took a big gulp. On the second floor opposite, a burly black man seemed to be thinking about something in front of the window, until he was embraced by a hot black girl. The person couldn't help but take another mouthful of alcohol. "So, this is your main profession?" A faint voice suddenly sounded not far above her head. She spat out her drink. At the same time, she quickly looked up, and saw a figure wearing a grayish-black hoodie walking down the fire escape. She raised her hand and wiped her mouth with her sleeve before narrowing her eyes to size up this person. She recalled that familiar voice, and her expression changed. "It's you." Luke walked down and took off his hood so that she could see most of his face. "Miss Jones, long time no see. You're still as dedicated as ever." Jessica Jones subconsciously looked at the camera beside her and the vodka, and was suddenly a little stumped. How did you find me?" Luke sat down on the stairs next to her and looked at the window opposite. "I was just passing by, but I noticed someone on the third floor with a professional camera. You must know how dangerous my job is. I thought you were taking pictures of me." At this point, he paused and pursed his lips with a teasing expression. "I didn't think you would take on this sort of traditional work." In the room on the second floor diagonally opposite, the man and woman were already leaning against each other, their expressions and actions very intimate. Jessica opened her mouth. "Whatever you say." Luke shrugged, then handed her a bag from his backpack. "Don't just drink. Have some snacks too. Otherwise, your job is very boring." Jessica stared blankly at the Chinese characters on the packaging. "What's this?" "Squid." Luke said, "If you don't like it, this one's fine too." He took out another bag from his backpack and stuffed it into her hands. Jessica looked at the packaging, which still had Chinese words on it. "What is this?" Luke said, "It's spicy. It's fun to eat them when you're bored. They're like spicy chips." As he spoke, he took out a lollipop and unwrapped it. Just as he was about to stuff it into his mouth, he suddenly turned to look at her. "Or, do you prefer lollipops?" In less than a second, there was a third item in Jessica's hand. After hesitating for a moment, she still chose to open the squid, and stuffed one into her mouth. It tasted neither bad nor good, but after taking another sip of the vodka, it was all right. "Want to talk about this job?" Luke pointed at the camera she had placed on the other side. Jessica paused, but she couldn't help herself. "Actually, it's not really a job." "Huh?" Luke was confused. Jessica said, "It's kind of personal." Luke looked at the tall and strong black man and asked, "You have a crush on him? But you shouldn't go so far as to take private photos of them." Jessica shot him a dirty look, but she couldn't help saying, "That's not his girlfriend. She's a married woman." Luke said, "So, it is a job." Jessica sighed, and suddenly wanted to tell him everything that had been bothering her. After hesitating for a long time, she dismissed the thought in the end, and changed the subject. "Why is it that after talking to you last time, I now dream less at night?" Luke knew what she was referring to. It was nothing more than a combination of mental communication and basic hypnosis. He had also borrowed the overflow of power from when his mental strength broke 40 to brainwash her. Although it wouldn't cure the root of her problem, it would blunt her mental issues for a short period of time. Luke had come running over to observe the mental state of this test subject and to evaluate the effects of the previous treatment. Furthermore, he had also learned Kilgrave's elementary pheromone control. But he wasn't Kilgrave. Whether it was money or looks, he had ample resources for attracting girls. He only used this ability when handling cases. At most, he would only use a small amount of his power on other women so that they would develop a favorable impression of him. He was very cautious when using it. And Jessica herself was the victim of this ability. Then, what if he used this ability to treat her psychological trauma? Luke was fairly certain that no matter how bad Jessica's mental state was, she wouldn't be any worse off after receiving treatment. At the same time, he could also test out the difference between Kilgrave's original ability and the partial version copied by the system. The reason Jessica was so laid back now wasn't because she had a good temper. This woman had been plagued by mental issues for a long time, and it was easier for her to lose control. Once she lost control, she could easily beat someone up. Without the effect of elementary pheromone control, even if she didn't attack him, there was an 80% chance of her turning around and leaving. How could he talk to her like that? Seeing the look of anticipation in her eyes, Luke chuckled and said, "I know a little psychology, and I know about Molly's case and treatment." Jessica couldn't help but ask, "How is she now?" Luke said, "She underwent very effective treatment before Christmas. She should be able to go home and rest soon." Jessica froze. What effective treatment? She didn't think there was any treatment that would work after being tortured by that sadist, Kilgrave. That kind of nightmare would inevitably follow the victim for the rest of their life. Luke rolled the lollipop around in his mouth. "She's much better now that she's seen Kilgrave's body and vented her feelings." Jessica gasped. "What?" She hadn't expected such an answer, and pressed, "Kilgrave is dead." Luke nodded. "He's been dead for half a month. His body is in the morgue at the forensics center. He'll be buried in a public cemetery soon." Jessica was incredulous. "How is that possible? How did he die?" Luke said indifferently, "He might have been involved in something. Have you heard about the smiling man who appeared in New York recently?" Jessica was stunned. She tilted her head and thought for a moment before she said uncertainly, "I think I heard about this person before. It seems that he's a vigilante who wears a smiling mask." Luke nodded and said, "That's more or less the case. Kilgrave was probably working with a gang, and the gang happened to be the smiling man's target, so he died along with dozens of other gang members." Jessica gaped. She didn't know how to digest this news. Kilgrave died, just like that. That demon-like, terrifying monster had died just like that. At that moment, Jessica felt like a village girl who was bullied by the village tyrant and could only hide in a corner where the other party couldn't see her. But one day, someone suddenly said that the village tyrant was killed by a passerby. After a long pause, she grabbed Luke's arm and asked, "Where's Kilgrave's body?" Luke said, "NYPD's Forensics Center." Jessica abruptly got to her feet and jumped down from the third floor. She landed with a thump, and was about to break into a run. Luke turned his head and said helplessly, "Hey, you don't want your alcohol or camera?" This was a professional camera. In his previous life, this thing had been jokingly called, "poor for 3 generations, a single snap destroys a lifetime." A professional camera could easily cost thousands of dollars. It was rare for ordinary people to play around with this thing. For a private investigator, this was more like a way to make ends meet. Without this thing, how could they take private photos of couples from a distance? How could they make it easy for their clients to file for divorce? Jessica paused. "Pack it up for me. I'm in a hurry." She was going to run off. Luke said, "Hey, are you going to force your way into the forensic center? There are police officers stationed there." Jessica said, "I'll think of a way." Luke looked at her like she was an idiot. "I can bring people in. What other way are you thinking of?" Jessica finally stopped and looked up at him. "You." Luke unhurriedly closed the bottle of vodka, put away the snacks, picked up the camera, and jumped. Jessica subconsciously took 2 steps forward, wanting to reach out and catch him. They had been on the 3rd floor just now. Her body was special, which was why she was able to jump down. It wasn't the same for Luke. Luke grabbed the 3rd floor staircase railing with his free hand as he jumped over it. After his feet found purchase on the 2nd floor railing, he jumped again and did the same thing until he landed on the street. He walked over and handed the camera to a stunned Jessica. "Did you drive?" he asked. Jessica shook her head. "No." She had a very strong physique and moved very quickly through the alleys and streets. She didn't need to drive at all. Luke pointed at a nearby alley. "My car is over there. Let's go." Half an hour later, Luke brought Jessica to the forensic center. There were fewer people at the forensic center at night, but there were also many people working overtime. As a line of work that was forever lacking manpower, forensic scientists were busier than ordinary detectives. Just like how the police department always had cases to solve, the forensic center also always had evidence to process. There was basically no hope of processing evidence for ordinary cases since it could very likely take months or even a year for the report to be published. In fact, detectives would avoid the need to process evidence if they could. Otherwise, they would have to wait several months for a report to be released. For major criminal cases, the standard process took a few weeks. Unless you had an in with someone you knew, it would be very difficult to get a report quickly. Fortunately, Luke wasn't here to get the report, but he did know someone. After Dr. Laney made a call, Luke took Jessica to the morgue. The forensic scientist who led the way was also very busy. He only noted Luke's name and department before he left. It was just this casual when you had a connection. If you didn't have one, you wouldn't even be allowed in at all. Naturally, Luke owed Dr. Laney a small favor this time. After the forensic scientist left, Luke said to Jessica, "Let's be clear about some things before we look at the body." Jessica nodded silently. "First, you're not allowed to destroy property here, especially the freezer and professional equipment. You can't afford to pay for them, nor will you be able to handle the problems that come with it," Luke said. Jessica was stunned. "Huh?" Luke said, "If you break the freezer, the bodies inside might be damaged. Repairing the freezer will cost you thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars. Do you have that much money?" Jessica. She really didn't have that much money. Or rather, she didn't have much money at all. "Second, don't beat Kilgrave's body to a pulp," Luke continued. "If you do, the coroner and I won't be able to explain it. You'll have to go to jail, too." Jessica hesitated. She really wasn't sure if she could hold back. Looking at her, Luke didn't say anything, but silently made a decision. If she went too far later, he would have to stop her. "Okay, I'm going to open the freezer now," he said. "Come back here." He walked over to the freezer, found the corresponding number, and pulled it out. He beckoned to Jessica again. When Jessica was 2 meters away, he motioned for her to stay put, then opened the zipper on the bag Kilgrave was in. The zipper opened down to the lower abdomen, revealing the obvious Y-shaped incision. It was a standard feature of an autopsy, enough to prove the guy was dead. But Jessica was stunned. Kilgrave's face appeared every night in her nightmares, leaving her to rely on alcohol to numb herself until she passed out drunk. That nightmare-like experience from long ago resurfaced in her mind again. Countless memories flooded her mind in an increasing wave. In the end, there was only the shocked and confused face of a black woman in her 20s and an order next to her ear. Kill her. The next moment, the woman was sent flying by a punch, and collapsed more than 10 meters away. Jessica pulled back her fist, her face blank. Jessica! Let's go! Kilgrave shouted from nearby. However, she didn't obey this order. She only stared blankly at the dead woman on the ground. Luke silently retreated behind her and watched as Jessica was lost in her reverie. Suddenly, she shouted loudly, "No!" At the same time, she punched the freezer. Bang! Bang! Luke's mouth twitched as he looked at the freezer drawer that had been knocked askew. I knew this would happen. Molly was still the best. The body didn't move even when she hit it. The person in front of him wasn't just a superhuman, she was a superhuman with massive strength and who liked to fight. However, he didn't plan to stop her. Since he had chosen her as a test subject, any property damage that happened during this period could be considered a research cost. In this day and age, it didn't have to cost an arm and a leg to do research. It was just a small sum of money. Jessica began to cry, getting louder and louder until she was finally bawling. Luke remained calm. Crying was actually a very good way to vent. Although excessive crying was harmful to the body, the person in front of him was someone who gargled with vodka every day. Crying out loud would be beneficial to her body and mind. Jessica cried for several minutes, then suddenly stepped forward to punch the body. Luke quickly took a step forward, and Jessica's body tilted. At the same time, he aimed his charged taser at her. Jessica instantly convulsed and fell. Luke put the taser away and grabbed her. He sighed helplessly. Her punch had been aimed at Kilgrave's head. Given how the door of the metal freezer was now askew from Jessica's punch, Kilgrave's head would definitely have shattered. Money wouldn't be enough to deal with the aftermath, and it would be very troublesome. Luke didn't want to clean up after her. But Jessica's condition right now was perfect. Luke helped place her in a chair, and began to use his various abilities to treat her. Half an hour later, he looked at Jessica, who had fallen asleep in the chair, and murmured, "This should do it. Let's see whether the treatment works in a few days." As he spoke, he took out his phone and gave his uncle in Las Vegas, Gilbert Grayson, a call. After he explained the situation and specially confirmed that no damage had been done to the evidence, old Grayson told him to wait for a call. A few minutes later, Luke's phone rang. The person on the other end said, "Luke Coulson?" Luke said, "Yes. You are Mac Taylor, from New York's Forensic Center. Gil called me. I need to confirm your situation there." Mac Taylor got straight to the point. Luke repeated what he had said to old Grayson. After hearing the details, Mac heaved a sigh of relief. "You're a detective, how can you do something like this?" Luke didn't get angry, and just said, "If this can help the victim escape the nightmare, even just a little, this can be considered one last value which the body has. After all, the living are more important than the dead." Mac was silent for a moment, before he said, "Wait there a minute. I'll get someone to check on the situation. If what you said is true, you can leave." Luke said, "Yes, thank you. I'll take responsibility for everything, including bringing someone in to take a look at the body." Mac was stumped. He had thought that old Grayson's nephew wanted him to keep everything under wraps. It seemed that this wasn't the other party's intent. This indeed wasn't Luke's intent. They were only here to look at the body. Kilgrave was HQ's case to begin with. If there was an accident, he would just pay for any property damage. He didn't need Mac to do much. He just didn't want to be questioned here tonight and have to write a bunch of reports later. This was just an accident. No one said anything, going by standard procedure was more annoying. It wasn't a problem to ask old Grayson for help. He was a top forensic expert in America, and most of the forensic scientists he knew were big names in the circle. After getting Luke's answer, the uneasiness in Mac's heart disappeared. He didn't want to bend the rules for anyone, but he couldn't refuse old Grayson's request. Luke had only looked for him to save himself some trouble, which was something Mac could help with. Not long after, the night supervisor of the forensic center came and briefly checked the situation. After noting down Luke's identity and phone number, he left. Luke carried the sleeping Jessica out and put her in the back seat of his car, before he drove to her office. He took the key from her and opened the door. He couldn't help but shake his head. He didn't know if it was because this woman was really lazy or because of her poor mental state that she didn't tidy up the place. The office looked the same as the last time he came. There was a lot of trash and empty bottles, and a blanket on the couch. It seemed that as long as a person was single, they didn't pay attention to the details, including the person he was carrying. Mocking her inwardly, Luke set Jessica down on the couch and covered her with the blanket. Squatting in front of the sofa, he muttered to himself for a moment, before finally whispering softly in her ear. At the same time, he finally activated elementary pheromone control to maximize the hypnotic effect. The entire process only took 30 seconds. Even if today's treatment was done, the entire treatment would have to continue for a period of time. It could be a week or two, or even a month. Luke didn't have that much time, and there was no way he would carelessly use elementary pheromone control to treat a mental illness. Jessica could be considered his main test subject. Stacy, of the trio of supergirls, was test subject number 2. Lastly, Kilgrave's victim, Molly, could be considered test subject number 3. For the time being, Luke planned to treat them and gain experience in using his abilities. He wouldn't waste a lot of time this way, and could learn to combine his various abilities together. This wasn't wasted effort. He had come up with elementary telekinesis and elementary annihilation in this way. Experimenting like this now, he might be able to develop a powerful mental ability, or possibly turn a support technique into an attack strategy. A mental ability might not do much as a physical attack, but it was a top-notch weapon against a person's inner psyche, and was far more powerful than firearms. If Luke had Kilgrave's full ability to control both men and women, he would be able to live a carefree life even without the system. That was the best choice for keeping a low profile and lurking behind the scenes. Of course, the system was better. There was no need to scheme against others, just do your own thing and work hard to increase your experience and credit points. With that in mind, he took one last look at Jessica, who was lying on the couch with a smile on her face and drooling. He shook his head and smiled. I hope you're one of the lucky ones. For Jessica, living like this wasn't any better than going insane. The worst was to experience pain and despair while sober. It was the same with Molly, who was also one of Kilgrave's victims. This was Luke's reason for choosing them as test subjects. They were like terminally ill patients. If they couldn't be cured, they might as well just die. The most painful thing was to carry on like this. Of course, it wasn't a glorious thing to make this kind of decision for others. Luke would compensate them in other ways. After hesitating for a moment, he took out a pen and paper, wrote down a message, and stuck it to the gleaming front door. People still needed to be pushed a little, and alcoholics were no exception. Taking advantage of the darkness, he left the office and drove back home. Bang 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 bang. There was the scattered sound of gunshots a little further away. This was a relatively empty area, with nothing to block the sound of gunfire. Luke sped up and approached the direction which the gunshots had come from. If he ran into criminals killing people, it would be a good source of income. If it was criminals fighting each other, it would be a good source of income x2. He really didn't mind earning a few hundred experience and credit points on the way home. When he arrived outside an old car workshop, there was a strong smell of blood. There was even a trail of it which led here from 100 meters away. From the smell, someone must have bled a lot in a truck as they entered this place. Of course, there was even more blood in the workshop. There were at least 7 or 8 people inside. And the battle was over. The gunshots which Luke had heard earlier had been the tail end of the conflict. He released a mini drone from his inventory to fly into the workshop. Looking at the figure on the screen, he was stunned for a moment, before he heaved a long sigh of relief. "I've finally found you, Frank Castle." For a moment, he almost wanted to laugh out loud. This matter had almost become a sore spot for him. Luke wasn't omnipotent, and wouldn't necessarily be able to find whoever he was looking for. However, Robert owed the man a huge favor, so Luke absolutely had to protect Frank Castle. He also knew about Frank's huge tragedy. His wife and children had all died one night, and he almost died himself, before he quietly disappeared. Luke didn't dare tell Robert about this at all. He was afraid that Robert would think of making a comeback. Frank Castle was still alive. If there was a grudge, there would be vengeance. The main culprit was still alive. Naturally, if Frank wanted revenge, he would have to do it himself. Luke was confident that he could handle this matter, so Robert could only enjoy the retired life at home with Catherine. Luke stopped the car and walked into the workshop. He even started humming a song. "I think I did it again. I made you believe, we're more than just friends." The middle-aged man who was checking the workshop to see if anyone had slipped through his fingers frowned. He suddenly turned around and raised the shotgun in his hand, aiming at the figure walking through the door. But he didn't shoot. The other party had started humming from about 20 meters away. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't soft either. Regardless of whether it was arrogance or something else, it was a sign that the other party had no intention of ambushing him. If it wasn't an ambush, then there was something he wanted. Frank had killed countless people, but he wouldn't kill innocents. The man in the gray hoodie stopped 10 meters away and greeted him. "I've been looking for you for a long time, Francis Stronghold. Gray Rabbit sends his greetings." Frank Castle's heart skipped a beat, but his expression remained cold. "Who are you?" Luke chuckled. "You can call me Puncher." Frank's face darkened, and he was about to pull the trigger. "Are you investigating me?" Luke said, "You could say that. It seems you need some help completing your revenge." He scanned the bodies of the criminals around him. "Correct me if I'm wrong." "Frank, what do you know?" Luke said, "Something happened to your family." "They, huh?" Boom. The shotgun suddenly opened fire, but Luke dodged it. He said helplessly, "Hey, I told you Gray Rabbit asked me to help you. Why are you still fighting?" Frank, however, had a ferocious look on his face. "You only know about this because you're on their side." Boom. 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 All 3 shotgun bullets missed. They hit the surrounding cars with a clatter. Luke immediately hid behind a truck and scratched his head. Of course, he understood what Frank meant. Those who had nothing to do with the deaths of his family couldn't possibly find him, because it had been almost 2 years. Also, Frank's psychological issues were no less severe than Jessica's. Should Luke really switch careers and become a psychiatrist? As he pondered, he jumped lightly off the side of the truck to circle around to the back. And Frank just happened to come around from the front. Boom. The shot missed again. Activating a combination of elementary sound wave, mental communication and basic hypnosis, Luke explained calmly, "It was Gray Rabbit who wanted to contact you. I investigated for a long time before I found the police department and hospital records. Besides, Gray Rabbit wouldn't hurt your family, right?" Frank's hot head felt as if a cup of water had been poured over it. He instantly became much more clear-headed. The record of his military discharge was confidential, and he and Gray Rabbit were part of the same secret unit. It was unlikely that the gangsters who killed his family had the capability to uncover such confidential information. No, those gangsters didn't know his identity, and they weren't inclined to look into it. Otherwise, they would have suspected him long ago. So, it was his mistake. Frank hesitated. Luke continued to talk as he launched his mental assault. At least let me finish. Gray Rabbit said that using his name would save my life. What's up with shooting me right off the bat? Frank hesitated even more when he heard that. Frank was ruthless toward bad guys, but even though Gray Rabbit was a weak chicken, they had gone through life and death together several times and had never betrayed each other. Who the hell are you? Don't talk about Puncher, those damn guys call me Punisher. You're saying you're not their accomplice, he finally said in a dark voice. Luke was dumbfounded. What? He never thought that there would be a problem here. But Puncher and Punisher had two completely different meanings, all right. Why so sensitive? Roasting Robert's old comrade in his heart, Luke said, "This isn't my first rodeo. Daredevil knows me too. His father is a boxer, Puncher, but it's not like he mistakes me for his dad." Frank was stumped again. You know Red? Luke said helplessly, he's called Daredevil, you call him Red? Fine, lawyer Matt did recently get a new outfit from somewhere, and it was indeed dark red. However, Frank had just shot lawyer Matt/Red in the head a few days ago. Matt's concussion was probably better now, but there was now a hole in his helmet. Thinking that, Luke suddenly felt that he wasn't too unlucky. Red, Matt had taken a solid shot. He was lucky he wasn't hurt. Frank hesitated even more. He usually didn't hesitate. He had just killed a bunch of enemies, and had run into someone who might be an enemy. The boiling desire for revenge made him not want to believe the other party's words. However, the other party spoke with confidence. Not only did he mention his old comrade, Gray Rabbit, he even mentioned Red. Red wasn't Frank's friend. There was no reason for the other party to mention him, but he had. He had heard a lot about Red's activities from the gang members. Since this person was Red's friend, he might not be a bad person. Listening to Frank's breathing and heartbeat, Luke knew that he had finally calmed down. He continued, "Can we talk somewhere else now?" But Frank was blunt. "No, these miscreants are dead. Just say whatever you want to say." Luke said, "Your name is Frank Castle, right?" "Calm down. I hacked into the police database and found some clues, but I need to ask you some questions. So, if you want to listen, stay calm." Frank's breathing turned heavy. "Speak. You and your family were attacked together back then, right?" Luke asked. "Yes," said Frank. Luke said, "This identity of yours was very clean. None of your army records were left behind, right?" "Yes," said Frank. Luke said, "Did you know that someone erased your relationship with your family from the police files and turned it into two separate cases?" Frank's emotions were in turmoil. "What do you mean?" He wasn't stupid, but it was difficult for him to control his emotions when it came to his family. It was also difficult for him to analyze it rationally. Even though he knew that Luke wasn't a bad guy, he couldn't help but want to take action, because Luke might be a gang member. Luke sighed and said, "If it's just a case of an innocent family accidentally killed by gunfire, why would it need to be covered up?" After a pause, he continued, "There are at least dozens of similar cases in New York every year. The only difference is the number of casualties. Your wife and children died, but that was just 3 victims. There was no need for NYPD to tamper with the file for a case like this." Frank seemed to get it. His face was horribly dark. "Someone from NYPD is involved. What are they trying to cover up?" Luke said, "Calm down. Do you want more clues?" Frank took several quick breaths to contain his impending outburst. "I'm listening." Luke said, "I checked the hospital records. You and your family were sent to Metropolitan General after the shooting, but there's nothing to show that you're related to each other. Also, someone signed a do not resuscitate order for you after your wife and children were declared dead. What do you think that means? Who did it? Frank roared. Who did it? At this point, it was obvious. Someone wanted to cover up the deaths of his family and even wanted him to die with his wife and children. It was very likely that this person was from the police. This was because only someone from the relevant department could sign such an order. Luke said, "Whatever you're thinking, go out and wait. I need to clean up this scene." Frank's eyes were bloodshot. He threw away the shotgun in his hand and strode over. "Tell me who it is." Luke had no choice but to come out from behind the car to meet him. Frank grabbed him by the collar. "Tell me who, Luke withdrew his hand and turned off the electric shock function on his glove. Holding the twitching Frank, he said, "Don't overthink it, this is just to calm you down a little. I'll help you find out who your enemies are. They can't escape, okay?" Despite his rage, these words lingered in Frank's mind. A moment later, Luke put him inside the car outside the workshop, and he watched Luke walk back in alone. A few minutes later, Luke got into the driver's seat and handed him a hood. "Have you calmed down? Cover your face if you have. I don't want anyone to know that you're in my car." Frank pulled the hood over his head silently. Luke drove west until he reached the Hudson River. He stopped the car in a quiet corner and said, "Logically speaking, you should have been able to find the information yourself. Why didn't you check it?" Frank was silent for a long moment. "I always thought it was all done by the three gangs in the park that day," he said sullenly. Pondering for a moment, Luke nodded. "There's no doubt they're the murderers. It's true that you killed them, but there were suspicious points in the police and hospital records." Frank gritted his teeth. There were undercover agents. It should have been a sting operation. There were 85 members from the three gangs there that day, and many of them were key figures. If they were all captured, a large number of drug traffickers would have been taken down in one go, which would have been a huge coup. Luke was surprised. It seemed that the electroshock therapy had been a good idea. However, he didn't care how smart the other party was. He was only here to help Robert return the favor. "Did you find anything else?" Frank said, "I interrogated some people who were present back then. They said that a big drug deal was supposed to go down. Someone contacted the three gangs about a large amount of goods, at least a ton." Luke was surprised. He didn't know about this. Of course, that was also because his only goal had been to find Frank. Luke hadn't investigated who had engaged in that three-way battle in the park. A lot of the information in the police case file had been tampered with. Not only was there very little information, it also wasn't detailed. Rubbing his chin, Luke said, "Your enemies are the Mexican cartel, the Irish gang, and the dogs of hell. The seller who gathered these three parties together in the park is also an enemy. The police." Luke actually wasn't certain on this point. It was definitely a huge mistake on the police's part for implicating Frank's family. But it would be an exaggeration to say that the police were Frank's enemy. The police definitely didn't want to implicate civilians. If that happened, not only wouldn't they get any credit, there would also be a lot of trouble. In a normal situation, the head of the operation wouldn't order their subordinates to act recklessly and disregard the lives of civilians. If they were caught, they might even lose their job. The important thing was that the person who planned this operation had to be someone important, like Dustin or a branch chief that had been given the go-ahead. Even the Major Crimes Division of a regular branch wasn't qualified to oversee such a major operation. As the thoughts flashed through Luke's head, he handed Frank a phone. "You can contact me with this. Delete the info after you've memorized it. Destroy the phone too." Frank took the phone and said nothing. Pondering for a few seconds, Luke said, "I just wanted to find you, so I didn't look further into what happened back then. Take a break for a couple of days. I'll go and see who in the police department was responsible for the case. This person must know more, which might be useful. Frank said nothing and continued to listen. Luke paid it no mind. If you go out and about, it's best to hide your face. Someone saw your face at the hospital, and it's possible that the police will come looking for you. Frank remained silent. Luke asked, "Where should I drop you off?" Frank, "At the intersection up ahead." Of course, it was a careless comment. Luke had no intention of going to Frank's place, either. The man might not necessarily believe him completely. After Frank got out of the car, Luke drove off and gave a huge sigh of relief. Now that he had found Frank, who wasn't planning on disappearing any time soon, it wasn't a huge problem. The truth was that if he wasn't helping Robert return a favor, he could stop worrying about Frank now. As long as Frank was alive, he was even more terrifying than Robert when it came to compatibility. It wasn't difficult for a person like this to seek revenge. The only thing Luke could do was keep the matter under wraps and make sure that a pile of corpses wasn't left behind every time. So what if dozens of gang members died? As long as they died quietly and no one saw them, they were just missing. It had no impact on social order, and NYPD had no time to pursue the matter. When his revenge was complete, Frank could go wherever he wanted, and Luke could provide him with cash to live a comfortable life. Of course, Frank might not need it. The firearms and ammo he was using were worth at least $100,000. Frank didn't have a job, and he hadn't used his credit card all this time. It was clear where this money came from. When Luke got home, Selena had washed up and was watching TV in the living room. When she saw that he was back, she took a second look. "You found Frank?" Luke grinned. "I found him. He's fine." Selena also smiled. "Then you can relax." Robert had never asked Luke for help before. It would be very unlucky if something went wrong the first time. After washing up, Luke sat down and told her what happened. Selena picked up the tablet and said, "I investigated it before, but I didn't have enough information to verify anything. Now, it's useful." Luke nodded. "Tell me about it." Selena tapped on the tablet, and it projected the content. Although many details of the case were erased, the detectives who handled the case did mention that they belonged to the Organized Crime Control Bureau. The Narcotics Division, however, doesn't have the authority to undertake such a huge operation, nor do they have the ability to tamper with so much information. Luke nodded slightly. Narcotics wasn't weak, but they weren't qualified or capable enough to plan an operation to capture nearly 100 gangsters. Selena said, "And based on what happened over the past few days, I've found a suspect, Samantha Reyes." When this case happened over a year ago, she was still NYPD's bureau chief, and the OCCB was under her authority. Not long after this case, she was transferred and became the district attorney. Luke raised an eyebrow. "It was her." Selena said, "Given her position, it's impossible for anyone to bypass her authority over the OCCB. So, she must know something." Luke rubbed his chin and said, "This DA is very interested in Grote's case. She personally came to take over just a few hours after getting the news." Selena said, "Then there really are too many coincidences. We can look into her." Luke nodded. "Go get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow." He could get Little Snail to look for information first. Anyway, now that he'd found Frank, things were less urgent. The next day was January 10th. Jessica woke up from a sound sleep and stretched. She felt lazy and comfortable. She went to the bathroom in a daze, and was sitting on the toilet when her eyes suddenly opened wide and she exclaimed, "Wait, last night. Kilgrave is dead." She paused for a moment, then scratched her head. What happened? In the past, whenever she thought of that person, her entire body would tense up. Now, however, she realized that she seemed to be too calm. Those memories were faded and hazy, as if they belonged to another person. Although she still felt disgust from the bottom of her heart, it felt like she was watching a TV drama. She sat there in a daze for a long while before she collected her thoughts. Although the memories no longer made her feel extremely uncomfortable, she felt that it was better not to dwell on them. She took a quick shower and walked out refreshed. She sat on the sofa and felt a little hungry. There wasn't any food in the fridge. She casually glanced around and saw 2 bags of snacks and a lollipop on the coffee table in front of her. She picked them up and looked at the Chinese words on the packaging. Images of last night on the fire escape came to mind. It seemed that a certain person had given her the 2 bags of snacks last night. She subconsciously picked up the opened bag of squid, and stuffed one into her mouth. Yep, it still didn't taste good nor bad. She finished the bag of squid in a few bites and threw it aside. She opened the other bag, picked out a chip and stuffed it into her mouth. After a couple of chews, she couldn't help but huff. What the hell is this? Why is it so spicy? Are these vodka chips? That being said, Jessica couldn't help but pick up another spicy chip and shove it into her mouth. She chewed on it and mumbled, "It tastes all right. But why is it so spicy?" She was so hungry that she quickly finished the bag. After washing her hands and coming out, she decided to go out for a proper lunch and get some sun. The weather in New York was good today, which was rare. Light gold sunlight shone through the window, warming the cold air. A moment later, Jessica put on her coat, the lollipop in her mouth. She fumbled with the change on her as she walked toward the gleaming door. Suddenly, she froze. There was a piece of paper stuck on the door. On the large piece of paper, there was only one simple statement: as per our agreement, one of the freezers in the morgue at the forensic center was damaged last night. The estimated maintenance cost is $5,000. Looking at the glaring $5,000, Jessica gulped and took her hand out of her pocket. There were only a few notes in her hand, 2 $10 bills and 3 $1 bills. You must be joking. How can it be so expensive? This is daylight robbery. A frustrated shout rang out at the door. An angry roar suddenly rang out from upstairs. Going crazy so early in the morning? If you're afraid of being poor, why don't you go out and rob someone? *TCH, I'll rob you first. Jessica roared above her head. Upstairs, come then. If you don't come, you're the son of a *TCH. But Jessica was no longer in the mood to argue with the lunatic upstairs. She stared blankly at the piece of paper for a moment, then tore it off, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it to the side. No, I didn't see anything. She was so poor that she could only eat dirt. How could she have so much money? A hallucination. Everything last night was a hallucination. She consoled herself and left the house. On the other side, Luke and Selena left after breakfast to visit some of the officers who had been involved in the 3-way battle in the park, but none of them seemed willing to talk about it. The 2 of them didn't pay it any mind, but they were already monitoring these people's phone records after interviewing them. When they returned home in the afternoon, Selena pursed her lips and said, "It looks like it's clear. 3 of them contacted their old boss, the current DA, Miss Reyes." Luke smacked his lips and said, "We might run into a minor conflict with the DA. Selena said, "She won't be that bold to come after us, right? We're investigating the attack on the Irish gang, it's not her case alone." Even as she said that, Dustin called. When Luke picked up the call, Dustin got straight to the point. "Luke, what case are you working on that you would actually provoke District Attorney Reyes?" Luke chuckled. "Did she look for you?" Dustin said, "She called me and told me to keep my men under control and not interfere with her arrangements." Luke was amused. "Oh, she thinks she's the boss of NYPD?" Dustin also smiled, apparently not taking Miss Reyes seriously. "Well, she used to be bureau chief, and has a lot of connections in HQ. Cut the crap and tell me what's going on." Luke said, "It's about the Irish gang. We suspect that it has something to do with a sting operation she was in charge of over a year ago. Something must have gone wrong during the operation. 3 civilians died and 1 was injured." Dustin pondered for a moment and said, "No wonder. She's preparing to run for the city council." Luke was enlightened. "Is she afraid that we'll dig up her dark history?" Dustin said, "That's very likely. What do you think?" Luke thought for a moment and chuckled. "It's fine. We don't have to investigate this case." "Aren't you going to run for the city council too?" Dustin laughed. F***ck off. Why would a poor man like me choose to become a council member? Reyes is just shy of getting it, which is why she's so nervous right now. Luke said, "Everyone has dreams. Who knows when they'll come true? I have faith in you, boss." Dustin couldn't help but laugh, too. He cursed and hung up. Selena glanced at Luke and said, "You're definitely not thinking of anything good." Luke said indifferently, "It's the DA, after all. We shouldn't provoke such a big shot, or we'll be in trouble." Selena was still staring at Luke. Luke said helplessly, "Fine, we'll work in secret." Selena finally looked away. "I knew it." Luke shrugged. "We just got here, and the boss is helping us take on the DA. That's too considerate of him. Just treat it as a private assignment." Hearing this, Selena's interest was piqued. "Then, should we go to her house tonight?" Luke thought for a moment. "It's not like we can't." Whatever other people said, it was better to hear it from the horse's mouth. However, they couldn't make any mistakes in this operation, and had to be careful. It would be best if Reyes herself didn't know. With that thought in mind, the two returned home. Night fell. After dinner, Luke looked at the information which Little Snail had gathered today, and called Foggy about Reyes. "How's the Groat case coming along?" Foggy lowered his voice. "It doesn't look good." Luke asked, "HM? What happened?" Foggy hesitated, then said, "Reyes wants to use Groat as bait to lure out a man named Edgar Brass, an important leader of the Mexican cartel." Luke frowned. "You agreed?" Foggy grimaced. "We had to. Groat's not a good person himself. If he's jailed now, it'll be for 20 years. Luke wasn't surprised. Groat was a scumbag. Don't get mixed up in it. Just stay away. Foggy was silent for a moment. "I'm with Reyes right now. The arrest operation she planned has already started." Luke was stunned. "So soon?" Foggy said, "She's in a hurry." Luke nodded thoughtfully. "All right. Reyes is in charge, right? Be safe and don't wander off." Foggy, "Got it, thanks." Luke hung up and asked, "Little Snail, did you trace the location?" Little Snail, close to the docks 2.3 kilometers north. Luke said, "If Selena asks, tell her I had something on," and went out. "Very well, sir," Little Snail replied. 2 minutes later, Luke left through the underground exit. He glided over the roofs and quickly approached the docks. The drone had already taken off and locked onto the location of the police personnel. These people all had walkie-talkies, so it wasn't too difficult to find them. Luke frowned when he saw who they were. It was ESU, Special Operations Division, which was the same as SWAT in Los Angeles.